In the climate-controlled vault beneath the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, there sits a clay prism no larger than a wine bottle. Its surface is covered in wedge-shaped marks, thousands of them, pressed into soft mud 4,000 years ago and baked hard by time. The artefact is catalogue number AN9N23.444, though most scholars know it simply as the Weld Blundell prism. It weighs perhaps 2 kilograms, but the information it contains weighs considerably more. The prism lists every king who ruled the cities of ancient Sumer, from the first ruler before the Great Flood to the dynasties that rose afterward. Each entry notes the king's name, his city, and the length of his reign. Standard historical record keeping, you might think, except for one detail that catches in the throat of every translator who reads it. The document doesn't begin with the first king's name. It begins with a single declarative sentence in Sumerian, Namlugal Antadadabar, when kingship descended from heaven, not emerged, not evolved, not seized through conquest or established through tribal agreement, descended from heaven to specific cities, to specific individuals, as if kingship itself were a tangible thing that could be transferred, measured and recorded, like grain counted in a storehouse or land measured with a surveyor's rope. The prism doesn't explain why kingship descended. It doesn't justify the claim or defend it against skeptics. It simply states it as observable fact, the way a modern document might note that a deed transferred ownership or that a will designated an heir. The tone is administrative, procedural, as if the scribe were documenting something everyone already understood, that authority to rule humanity didn't originate with humans. And then come the names. Alulim of Eridu, who ruled 28,800 years. Alaulgar, who ruled 36,000 years. 8 kings total before the flood swept over the land. Then the second list begins, the kings after the deluge, when, as the prism puts it, kingship descended from heaven a second time, to different cities, to different men. Following criteria the text assumes you already know. Wherever you are right now, in bed as the night settles around you, or perhaps in the deep quiet of early morning, take a moment to comment where you're listening from, because what we're about to explore isn't some distant academic puzzle. It's a question that reaches across 4,000 years of clay tablets, royal inscriptions, temple hymns, and flood narratives to ask something that still echoes in how we think about leadership, inheritance, and human potential. What if the ancient Sumerians weren't recording myths? What if they were documenting an actual system, one in which certain families were deliberately chosen to receive knowledge, authority, and the capacity to govern, not because of their strength or cunning, but because of something that could be measured, transferred, and preserved across generations? The tablets exist, the museums hold them, the translations are verified. What remains uncertain is what exactly the Sumerians thought they were recording when they pressed these words into clay, that kingship descended from heaven, that it was given to specific bloodlines, that this was not a metaphor but a procedure. Let the questions settle into the quiet as we begin. When kingship descended from heaven, the land between the two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, in what is now southern Iraq, gave birth to what most scholars consider humanity's first urban civilization. Around 4500 BC, something changed in the way humans organized themselves. Villages became cities. Scattered settlements consolidated into Eridu, Ur, Uruk, Nippur, Lagash. Mud brick temples rose on artificial mountains called ziggurats. Irrigation channels cut precise lines across the floodplain, and for the first time in the archaeological record, human beings began to write. The Sumerians didn't invent writing to record stories or compose poetry. They invented it for accounting, to track barley rations, to note how many sheep belonged to the temple, to record which families owed labour service to which landowner. The earliest tablets are economic documents, lists, tallies, receipts, Writing emerged as a tool of administration, not art. This tells us something important about the Sumerian mind. They were practical people, methodical. When they recorded information, they did so because that information mattered for the operation of their society. They documented what needed to be remembered, what needed to be transferred to the next generation, what established legal claims and social obligations. By 3200 BC, Sumerian cities had developed all the hallmarks of complex civilization: monumental architecture, social stratification, specialized labor, long-distance trade, and centralized political authority. Each city functioned as an independent city-state, ruled by a lugal, a word that translates literally as big man, or more formally as king. These rulers oversaw vast temple estates, organized large-scale construction projects, commanded military forces, and served as intermediaries between their citizens and the gods. The gods were not distant abstractions to the Sumerians. They were persons, invisible, powerful, immortal persons who owned the cities, resided in the temples, and required service from humanity. Each city belonged to a particular deity. Eridu belonged to Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water. Ur belonged to Nanna, the moon god. Uruk belonged to An, the sky god, and later to the goddess Inanna. The king didn't rule on his own authority. He ruled as the god's steward, the god's tenant, the god's appointed manager of divine property. This is crucial context for everything that follows. When Sumerian texts speak of kingship descending from heaven, they're not making a vague poetic claim. They're describing what they understood to be the actual origin of political authority, that the gods, who owned everything, selected specific individuals to manage human affairs on their behalf. By 2100 BC, someone, we don't know who, compiled various king lists from different cities into a single unified document. This became what we now call the Sumerian king list. Multiple copies exist, found at Nippur, Lhasa, and other sites. The most complete version, the Weld Blundell Prism, was purchased from an antiquities dealer in 1922 and now resides in Oxford. Another significant copy, catalogue number CBS 15365, sits in the University of Pennsylvania Museum in Philadelphia, excavated from the ruins of ancient Nippur. These aren't mythological texts, they're historiographic documents, attempts to organise the past into coherent chronological sequence. They list dynasties in order, noting when kingship moved from one city to another. The structure is formal, repetitive, almost bureaucratic. In Eridu, kingship was exercised. Alulim ruled 28,800 years. Alaulgar ruled 36,000 years. Two kings ruled for 64,800 years. Then Eridu fell and the kingship was taken to Bad Tabira, and so on through 8 kings and 5 cities until the flood. Then, after the flood had swept over, when kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Kish. The list resumes. 23 kings in Kish. Then kingship moves to Eanna, then to Ur, then back to Uruk. Dynasty after dynasty, some of whose rulers we can verify through other archaeological evidence, some of whom remain attested only in this list. Mainstream scholarship treats the antediluvian section, those 8 kings with their impossibly long reigns, as mythological. Fair enough. No one seriously proposes that Alulim ruled for 28,800 years. But what's interesting is not the numbers themselves. It's that the compiler felt compelled to include them, to preserve them, to integrate them into what otherwise appears to be a genuine attempt at historical record keeping. Why include mythological material in a historical document unless you believed that material contained some kind of historical truth, unless you believed something actually happened before the flood, some form of organised kingship that needed to be remembered? The king list doesn't explain the long reigns. It doesn't apologise for them or signal that they should be read differently than the later, more realistic numbers. It presents them with the same administrative tone, the same documentary style, as if the scribe was simply copying from older records, whose meaning he may not have fully understood, but whose preservation he considered important. Because here's what the text explicitly states. Twice, kingship descended from heaven, once before the flood, once after. In both cases, it was given to specific cities, to specific individuals, following some principle of selection the text never fully explains. Later Mesopotamian literature provides more detail. In the Sumerian composition Inanna and the Me, we learn that kingship was one of over 60 Me, divine decrees or cosmic principles that governed reality. These Me included things like priesthood, sexual intercourse, music, metalworking, and the art of war. They weren't abstract concepts. The text described them as objects, as tangible things that could be stolen, transferred, or bestowed. Inanna, goddess of Uruk, famously got the god Enki drunk and tricked him into giving her dozens of Me, which she then transported to her city in the boat of heaven. The Me of kingship was apparently among these portable, transferable authorities. In another text, the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic composed around 1750 BC, we encounter the concept of the Tablet of Destinies. This object, described as an actual clay tablet impressed with cylinder seals, conferred supreme authority on whoever possessed it. The god Enlil held it first. Later, the storm bird Anzu stole it, throwing the cosmos into chaos until the hero god Ninurta recovered it. Eventually it passed to Marduk, the chief god of Babylon, legitimating his rule over the other gods. These narratives present divine authority as something that can be held, stolen, transferred, and documented, not earned through virtue or strength, but bestowed according to divine decision, and then recorded in witness. What the Sumerian king list documents, then, is not a list of mythological figures who never existed. It's a record of a system in which political authority was understood to originate with the gods, to be transferred to specific bloodlines, and to move between dynasties according to divine will rather than human ambition. The question that haunts every scholar who studies these texts is simple but profound. Why did the Sumerians organize their understanding of kingship this way? Why did they insist, across hundreds of documents, across thousands of years, that legitimate rule required divine selection? Why did they document genealogies with such care, noting which kings claimed descent from gods, which rulers married priestesses, which dynasties could trace their lineage back to before the flood? If kingship was simply a matter of military strength or political cunning, why go to such lengths to document its divine origin? Why create elaborate myths about me tablets and tablets of destinies unless these represented real concepts within their legal and political framework, concepts that mattered for establishing legitimate authority? The Sumerians built the first civilization. They invented writing, mathematics, the wheel, the plough, bronze metallurgy, astronomical observation, legal codes, and urban planning. They were not primitive or credulous. When they recorded that kingship descended from heaven, they did so with the same methodical care they brought to every other aspect of their society. Perhaps the question isn't whether we believe them. Perhaps the question is whether we understand what they meant. The language of authority. For 3,000 years, cuneiform script lay silent. The last person who could read it died sometime in the 1st century C. After that, the thousands of clay tablets scattered across Mesopotamia became mere curiosities, inscribed bricks, decorative objects, unreadable puzzles. The language was lost. The culture that produced it had vanished. The very memory that such a civilization had existed faded into biblical fragments and Greek legends. Then, in the spring of 1802, a German schoolteacher named Georg Friedrich Grotefend stood before the Royal Society of Sciences in Göttingen and announced that he had deciphered the names of 3 Persian kings in an unknown script. He had worked backward from Old Persian, a language scholars could read, to crack a more ancient cuneiform system. It was the first crack in the code. Others would follow. By 1857, the Royal Asiatic Society conducted a famous experiment. They gave the same unpublished Assyrian text to 4 different scholars: Henry Rawlinson, Edward Hincks, Julius Oppert, and William Fox Talbot, working independently. All 4 produced nearly identical translations. Akkadian cuneiform, the language of Babylonia and Assyria, could now be read with confidence. But Akkadian wasn't the oldest layer. Beneath it lay Sumerian, a language unrelated to any known linguistic family, a tongue that had been dead for 2,000 years before Akkadian scribes stopped writing. Sumerian was harder. No living language gave clues to its grammar. But gradually, through bilingual texts, Marian with Akkadian translations, through vocabulary lists compiled by ancient scribes, learning their own antiquity, through sheer persistence, scholars began to recover Sumerian as well. What they found, once they could read it, was both expected and strange. The expected part, Sumerian had precise terminology for political offices, religious roles, economic transactions, legal procedures. The word Lugal appeared constantly in royal inscriptions. Its components are clear. Lu means man or person, and Gol means great or big. Lugal, the big man, the great one, the king. But Sumerian distinguished between different kinds of authority. An Ensi was a city governor or priest king, one who combined religious and political functions. An En was a high priest or priestess, one who represented the deity in temple rituals. A Sukal was a minister or vizier, a trusted administrator. Each term carried specific implications about the source and scope of authority. Namlugal meant kingship itself, not a king, but the abstract quality or office of being king. The prefix Nam converts nouns into abstract concepts or states of being. Namtila, life. Nam-El, humanity. Nam-En, priesthood. Namlugal, kingship, the state or condition of exercising royal authority. When the Sumerian king list says Namlugal and Tadadiabar, it's not saying that a king came from heaven. It's saying that kingship, the institution, the office, the legitimate authority to rule, descended from the heavenly realm to the earthly realm. This is a legal claim, not a poetic flourish. It establishes origin and therefore legitimacy. Sumerian political theory, as far as we can reconstruct it from texts, rested on a straightforward premise: the gods owned everything. They created humanity to work the land, to maintain the temples, to provide the gods with food, drink, and honour. Cities were divine property. The Lugal was the god's tenant farmer on a cosmic scale, appointed to organise human labour, maintain order, and ensure the god's estate prospered. This is why royal inscriptions spend so much time justifying the king's selection. They don't say, "I conquered this city." They say, "The god Enlil looked upon me with favour and gave me the kingship." They don't boast about personal ambition. They document divine appointment. Consider the inscription of Ur-Namma, founder of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, around 2100 per se. At that time, the god Nana, lord of the city, greatly exalted Ur-Namma. To make justice prevail in the land, to eliminate evil and violence, he called him. Or Hammurabi of Babylon, around 1750 per se, when the lofty Anu, king of the Anunnaki, and Enlil, lord of heaven and earth, determined the destinies of the land, they gave to Marduk, firstborn of Enki, the Enlilship over all peoples, and determined for Babylon a destiny of great power. At the time, the gods Anu and Enlil called me by name Hammurabi to make justice appear in the land. The pattern repeats across centuries. Kings claim their authority came from the gods. They were called, chosen, given the office, not because they were strongest or wisest, but because the divine assembly decided to transfer Nam, Lugal, to them. This brings us to one of the strangest and most important concepts in Sumerian theology. The word me, Urwin, is notoriously difficult to translate. Scholars render it variously as divine decrees, cosmic principles, cultural norms, powers, or simply leave it untranslated as me. The problem is that Sumerian texts treat the me as simultaneously abstract and concrete, as both ideas and objects. In the myth Inanna and Enki, the goddess Inanna travels to the city of Eridu to visit the god Enki, lord of wisdom and fresh water. Enki hosts a feast. They drink beer. Enki, drunk and jovial, begins giving Inanna the me, over 60 of them including the me of kingship, the me of godship, the me of priesthood, the me of truth and falsehood, the me of the art of lovemaking, the me of musical instruments, the me of wisdom and understanding, the me of judgment and decision-making, the me of the destruction of cities. Inanna loads these me into the boat of heaven and sails back to Uruk before Enki sobers up and realizes what he's done. He sends his minister to retrieve them, but Inanna refuses to return them. The me, including kingship, remain in Uruk. The text describes the me as things that can be grasped, carried, stolen, yet they're also described as knowledge, as capacity, as authority. They seem to function as something like cosmic operating permissions, divine authorizations that allow certain functions to be performed, certain roles to be exercised. Kingship, in this framework, isn't something you seize, it's something you're given. It's a me that must be transferred from the divine realm to the human one. And once transferred, it can move from person to person, from dynasty to dynasty, but it cannot be generated from nothing. It must descend from heaven, because only the gods can authorize it. This explains the obsessive concern with genealogy in Sumerian royal inscriptions. It's not enough to be powerful. You must demonstrate that you received the me of kingship legitimately, either through divine selection, through inheritance from a previous legitimate king, or through some ritual that transferred the authority to you. The Tablet of Destinies represents a similar concept. In Akkadian, it's called up M2, literally Tablet of Fates. It's described as a clay tablet inscribed with cuneiform and sealed with cylinder seals, functioning as a permanent legal document conferring authority. Whoever possessed the Tablet of Destinies held the supreme authority to determine the fate of gods and humans. In the myth of Anzu, the Stormbird demon steals the tablet from the god Enlil while he's bathing. With the tablet, Anzu can decree realities, command obedience, alter the cosmic order. The gods fall into panic. Who can challenge Anzu when he holds the tablet? Eventually, the warrior god Ninurta recovers it, but only through great effort and the support of other deities. The tablet is not mere symbolism. In the logic of the myth, it represents actual authority, measurable, transferable, essential for legitimate rule. When we combine these concepts, Nam Lugal descending from heaven, the me as transferable authorities, the Tablet of Destinies as the legal document conferring power, a consistent picture emerges. The Sumerians understood political authority as something external to human will. You didn't become king by wanting to be king, you became king by receiving something from outside yourself, something that could only come from the gods. And this brings us to the uncomfortable question that mainstream scholarship rarely addresses. Why would a civilization as sophisticated as Sumer organize its entire political theology around this idea unless they had some reason to believe it was true? Not necessarily true in the literal sense that gods physically handed tablets to humans, but true in the sense that legitimate authority required something beyond human ambition. That kingship demanded a special quality, capacity, or inheritance that not everyone possessed, that certain families, certain bloodlines had received something that qualified them to rule. The language doesn't support reading these texts as pure mythology or poetic metaphor. The grammar is too precise, the terminology too technical, the repetition across hundreds of documents too consistent. When Sumerian texts say kingship descended from heaven and was given to specific individuals, they're using the language of legal transfer, of witness transaction, of documented inheritance. Perhaps the question isn't what the words mean. Perhaps the question is what exactly descended. The mechanics of selection. If kingship was transferred, descended from heaven, moved between dynasties, bestowed on chosen individuals, then there must have been mechanics to the process, criteria, procedures, methods by which one bloodline was selected over another, one candidate chosen over rivals. The texts remarkably provide details. The most explicit account appears in a Sumerian literary composition known as Inanna and Enki, the transfer of the me. The poem, preserved on tablets from around 2000 BC, but likely much older in oral tradition, describes how divine authority moved from the ancient city of Eridu to the younger city of Uruk, and it describes the transfer as a literal transaction. Inanna, patron goddess of Uruk, undertakes a journey. She's young among the gods, ambitious, seeking to elevate her city's status. She travels to Eridu, the oldest of Sumerian cities, home to the god Enki, the lord of wisdom, fresh water, and, crucially, keeper of the me. The text is worth quoting directly from the translation by Samuel Noah Kramer. Inanna set her mind from highest heaven toward the Abzu below. The goddess, from highest heaven toward the Abzu below, set her mind. My lady, from highest heaven toward the Abzu below, set her mind. The repetition is characteristic of Sumerian poetry, emphasizing Inanna's determination. She's travelling with intent. She arrives at Eridu, and Enki greets her with hospitality, offering her a feast. Then comes the pivotal scene. Enki and Inanna drink beer together. The text lists 7 toasts, 7 rounds of drinking, and after each toast, Enki gives Inanna a set of men. The list eventually includes over 60 divine decrees, including Enki and Inanna drank beer together. They drank more beer together. They drank yet more beer together. Enki, in his joy, said to Inanna, "In the name of my power, in the name of my Abzu, I shall give the me to holy Inanna." He presented to her the me of end-ship, the me of lugalship, the me of godship, the noble and enduring crown, the throne of kingship. The text continues through crafts, arts, musical instruments, sexual practices, emotional states, and finally destructive powers. The me of warfare, the me of the plundering of cities, the me of lamentation. When Enki sobers up, he realizes what he's done. He sends his minister Isimud to intercept Inanna and recover the me. But Inanna has already loaded them into the boat of heaven, her sacred vessel, and is sailing back to Uruk. Isimud confronts her at 6 different locations, demanding she return the me. Each time, Inanna's attendant Ninshuba defends her, and Inanna continues to Uruk. When she arrives, she unloads the me at the dock of Uruk, presenting them to a city one by one. The poem describes the people celebrating as each me is brought forth. The transfer is complete. Uruk now possesses what Eridu once held, the divine authorities that allow a city to function as a cosmic capital. Most scholars read this as a political myth, justifying Uruk's rise to prominence over older Eridu. Fair interpretation. But notice what the myth assumes about how authority works. First, divine power is portable. It exists as distinct me that can be separated from one place and moved to another. Second, these me can be transferred even if the original holder doesn't intend to transfer them. Enki is tricked. Yet once the transfer occurs, once Inanna has possession, it cannot be undone by force. The me respond to new ownership. Third, there's a procedure to the transfer. Inanna doesn't steal the me in secret. She receives them in the context of hospitality, gift-giving, and verbal bestowal. Enki says, "I shall give the me to holy Inanna." He announces it. The act is witnessed by Isimud, by the other gods who are presumably present at the feast. This matters because in ancient Near Eastern legal tradition, witnessed verbal declarations carried binding force. Fourth, once transferred, the me manifest in the receiving city. Uruk doesn't just claim the me, they exhibit them. The people see them. The reality of the transfer is observable in Uruk's subsequent capacity to exercise kingship, priesthood, and all the other authorities the me represent. This isn't how myth typically works. Myth explains origins through dramatic narrative, through gods fighting monsters, through cosmic battles and primordial creation. But this reads more like a legal case study. It describes a contractual transfer using gift law. The drama comes from the ethical question: is it fair to trick someone into giving away authority, not from violence or chaos? The Tablet of Destiny's narratives follow a similar pattern, but with an important difference. Theft of the tablet causes cosmic dysfunction until legitimate authority is restored. In the Akkadian myth of Anzu, reserved in copies from around 1200 BC, but based on much older Sumerian sources, the stormbird Anzu serves in the palace of Enlil, king of the gods. One day, while Enlil is bathing, Anzu steals the Tablet of Destinies and flees to his mountain stronghold. The text describes the immediate consequence. He took away the Enlil ship, sacred responsibilities were abandoned, Anzu flew away and went into hiding in his mountain. Father Enlil was speechless. Silence settled over the room. The gods of the land assembled one by one. The gods realize they face a crisis. Anzu holds the tablet, which means he can decree fates, command obedience, reshape reality according to his will. But he's not legitimate. He stole authority rather than receiving it properly. Yet none of the gods can challenge him. Whoever approaches Anzu will be subject to the tablet's power. Finally, the warrior god Ninurta volunteers. His mother, the goddess Mami, gives him crucial advice. The thief who became a fugitive was holding the god's Enlil ship. Your strength will be invincible against Anzu. Ninurta battles Anzu repeatedly. The tablet protects Anzu. Arrows shot at him return to their quiver, unable to harm the tablet's bearer. Eventually, through trickery and the help of other gods, Ninurta manages to slay Anzu and recover the tablet. He brings it back to Enlil, and cosmic order is restored. The myth makes explicit what the Inanna story implies. Legitimate authority requires proper transfer. Stolen authority causes dysfunction. Even if you hold the Tablet of Destinies, if you took it illegitimately, reality itself resists you. Other gods will intervene to restore proper order. These aren't just interesting stories. They're legal precedents encoded in narrative form. They establish the principles by which divine authority functions. Authority originates with the highest gods, Anu, Enlil, Enki. It can be transferred downward to lesser gods, then to human kings. Transfer requires either legitimate gift or inheritance. Seized authority is inherently unstable and will be challenged. Witnesses matter, declarations matter, procedures matter. Now apply this framework to the Sumerian king list's repeated phrase, kingship descended from heaven. The phrase uses the verb di, which means to go out, to issue forth, to descend. It's the same verb used when water flows from a source, when instructions are issued from a king, when goods are dispensed from a storehouse. It implies intentional transfer from a higher location to a lower one. Antar means from heaven, from the cosmic realm where gods dwell. So kingship, Namlugal, the office itself, was intentionally transferred from the divine realm to the human realm, given out, dispensed, according to some divine decision. The king list doesn't tell us why Eridu was chosen first, why Alulim specifically became the first king. It presents the selection as accomplished fact, but later Sumerian literature fills in the pattern. Kings are chosen based on divine favour. The god looks upon a person with love or approval. Wisdom, the capacity to make just decisions, often described as a gift from Enki. Shepherding capacity, kings are repeatedly called shepherds who tend the people like flocks. Royal blood, descent from previous legitimate kings. Divine parentage, literal descent from a god through one parent, creating semi-divine lineage. That last criterion is where things get particularly interesting and particularly strange. Because Sumerian texts don't treat divine parentage as metaphor, they document it as genealogical fact, noting which kings had divine mothers or fathers, what fraction of their nature was divine versus human, and how this hybrid status qualified them for rule. The most famous example, of course, is Gilgamesh. The Sumerian king list identifies him as the 5th king of Uruk, ruling after the flood. It notes his father Lugalbanda and specifies that Lugalbanda was a god. The Epic of Gilgamesh adds that his mother was Ninsun, a goddess of wisdom. This makes Gilgamesh, in the literal arithmetic of the text, 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. How does one become 2/3 divine? The math doesn't work by normal genetics, but if divinity is treated not as substance, but as capacity, as the presence of me, as the transmission of divine qualities that can be measured in some way, then perhaps the fraction makes sense. Gilgamesh received double inheritance, divine nature from both parents, human nature from his father's mortal body, 2 parts divine capacity, 1 part mortal limitation. What matters here is not whether we believe the biology. What matters is that Sumerian scribes recorded these genealogies with precision, as if the fractions were meaningful, as if the proportion of divine to human heritage directly related to fitness for rule. Later kings didn't claim to be 2/3 divine like Gilgamesh, but they did claim divine parentage in less dramatic forms. The kings of the Ur-3 dynasty around 2100 claimed descent from Gilgamesh through Lugalbanda and Ninsun, placing themselves in a documented bloodline that traced back to divine human hybrids. The pattern across Sumerian history is consistent legitimate kings either descended from previous legitimate kings, or they were directly chosen by the gods, often indicated through dreams, omens, or priestly confirmation, or both. The claim to rule required demonstrating connection to the original transfer, that moment when kingship descended from heaven and was given to the first human families. This is not how power typically justifies itself. Conquerors don't usually go to elaborate lengths to prove they were chosen by previous legitimate authority. They declare themselves legitimate by virtue of victory. But Sumerian kings, even powerful ones like Sargon of Akkad, who built an empire through military conquest, still felt compelled to claim divine selection, to be called by name by the gods, to receive kingship properly rather than simply seizing it. It suggests they believed, or wanted their subjects to believe, that kingship couldn't function properly unless it descended, unless it was transferred according to procedures established at the beginning when the institution first came from heaven. The question remains, what actually descended? What was transferred? Was it merely a social fiction, a useful ideology for maintaining order? Or did the Sumerians preserve memory of something more tangible? Knowledge, training, bloodline inheritance of cognitive capacity, initiated wisdom passed from generation to generation. The texts call it kingship. They describe it as portable, transferable, essential for legitimate rule. They document its movement across dynasties with the same care they documented economic transactions. Perhaps we should take them at their word, not that literal gods existed, but that something real was being transferred, something that made certain families capable of organizing civilization, making just decisions, transmitting knowledge, maintaining cosmic order. And perhaps the king list's antediluvian section, those 8 impossibly long reigning kings before the flood, documents where that transfer began. Bloodlines before the deluge. 8 kings ruled before the flood swept over the land. The Sumerian king list presents them without preamble, without explanation, as if every rereader would already know what this means. The list simply begins. After kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. In Eridu, Alulim became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. Alulgar ruled for 36,000 years. 2 kings, they ruled for 64,800 years. Then the kingship moved to Bad Tabira, where 3 more kings ruled, Enmen-Luana for 43,200 years, Enmen-Garlana for 28,800 years, and the divine Dumuzi, he's known as Tammuz, for 36,000 years. Then to Larag, where one king, Ensipasiana, ruled 28,800 years, then to Sippar, where Enmenjarana ruled 21,000 years, finally to Shurupak, where Ubaratutu ruled 18,600 years. Total 8 kings, 5 cities, 241,200 years. Then the text states simply, the flood swept over. After which, after the flood had swept over, and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. The post-flood dynasties begin with more realistic numbers, reigns of 20, 30, 40 years. Kings we can sometimes verify through other archaeological evidence. The chronology becomes historical rather than mythical. Scholars have spent over a century debating those antediluvian numbers. The most common interpretation, they're purely mythological, invented to give the deepest antiquity possible to Sumerian civilization. The numbers serve to push kingship back into primordial time, to claim that Sumerian culture was coeval with the creation of the world itself. Fair interpretation. Except for one problem, the numbers aren't random, they follow patterns. Samuel Noah Kramer noted in the 1950s that many of the reign lengths are multiples of 3600. In Sumerian mathematics, 3600 was written with a special sign, the sar, and represented one complete cycle. It was 60 squared, the square of the Sumerian base unit. Let's look again. Alulim, 28,800 years, Klo 8 sar. Alorgar, 36,000 years, 10 sar. Enmenluana, 43,200 years, 12 sar. Enmen-Garlana, 28,800 years, Ho 8 sar. Dumazid, 36,000 years, 10 sar. Ensipasiana, 28,800 years, Ho 8 sar. Enmenjarana, 21,000 years, doesn't fit the pattern perfectly, but equals 5,833.3600. Ubaratutu, 18,600 years, Aureliala. The first 6 kings rule for perfectly divisible multiples of the sar. The last 2 don't fit quite as neatly, but they're still huge round numbers in the Sumerian base 60 system. This suggests the numbers aren't arbitrary a very long time ago figures, they're calculated, systematic. They encode information using Sumerian mathematical principles. But information about what? One theory, astronomical cycles. The number 3600 approximates certain celestial periods. The precession of the equinoxes completes a full cycle in about 25,920 years, which divides neatly into 3,600-year intervals. The planet Venus completes specific synodic cycles that Sumerian astronomers tracked with extraordinary precision. Perhaps the antediluvian king's reign lengths document astronomical time rather than political time. Another theory, their compressed genealogies. Instead of listing every king individually over thousands of years, the Sumerians summarized entire dynasties under single names, using the large numbers to represent the full duration of that dynasty or era. A third theory, more speculative, the numbers preserve memory of an actual prediluvial civilization, but the calendar system was different. If years meant something other than solar years, months perhaps, or seasons, or some other unit, then dividing by 12 or 30 brings the numbers into plausible ranges for very long-lived patriarchs. Alulim's 28,800 years becomes 2,400 months, or 200 years. Still impressive, but not impossible. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect isn't the length of the reigns. It's that the king list preserves memory of kingship existing before the flood, before the catastrophe that reset civilization, and that it documents 8 specific individuals ruling in 5 specific cities who held authority during that antediluvian era. Other Mesopotamian texts expand on this period. The most important is a composition known as the Eridu Genesis, or the Sumerian flood story, preserved fragmentarily on a tablet excavated from Nippur number CBS 1673, now in the University of Pennsylvania Museum. The tablet is damaged, with significant gaps, but enough survives to reconstruct the narrative. The text begins with the creation of humanity. The gods, particularly Anki, Enlil, Ninhursag, and Enki, form humans from clay to work the land and dig irrigation canals. They establish 5 cities: Eridu, Bad Tabira, Lurag, Sippar, and Shuruppak. Notice the exact same 5 cities from the king list. The text then indicates that kingship descended from heaven and humans flourished for an unknown period. But humanity becomes too numerous, too noisy. Enlil grows annoyed with their clamour and decides to destroy them with a flood. However, Enki, the god of wisdom, opposes this plan. He cannot directly defy Enlil, the king of the gods, but he devises a workaround. He speaks to a reed wall, knowing that the righteous king Ziusudra is listening on the other side. Ziusudra, pay attention to my words. By our hand, a flood will sweep over the cities, the cult centres. To destroy the seed of mankind is the decision of the divine assembly. By the word commanded by An and Enlil, its origin will be the destroyer of mankind. I have spoken to you. Build a very large boat. Ziusudra, described explicitly as a king, pious and wise, builds the boat. The flood comes. 7 days and 7 nights. The storm rages. Then sunlight returns. Ziusudra opens the window of his boat, makes offerings to the gods An and Enlil, and receives their blessing. Ziusudra, the king, prostrated himself before An and Enlil. An and Enlil gave to Ziusudra eternal life, like a god. Eternal breath from heaven they brought down for him. Then comes a damage section, after which the text concludes with references to animals being preserved and humanity being restored. This narrative matches the flood accounts in the later Atrahasis epic Akkadian, around 1700 bits, and the flood story in Tablet C of the Epic of Gilgamesh, both of which feature a human survivor, Atrahasis or Utnapishtim, who is warned by Enki, builds a boat, preserves seed of all living things, and is rewarded with immortality. But the Sumerian version adds a crucial detail. Ziusudra is a king, not just any human, but the last antediluvian king, the 8th king listed in the king list, under the name Ubaratutu, though later tradition identifies him as Ziusudra, son of Ubaratutu. Why does this matter? Because it means the flood survivor wasn't selected randomly. He wasn't chosen merely for personal righteousness. He was chosen because he already held kingship. The Nam Lugal that had descended from heaven to the first king Alulim then passed through 7 successors and finally resided with Ziusudra when the gods decided to destroy humanity. The divine decision wasn't just to preserve humans, it was to preserve kingship, to ensure that the line of authority, the bloodline that had received the capacity to rule, would continue after the catastrophe. This reframes the entire flood narrative. In the biblical version, Noah is saved for his righteousness. God saw that Noah was just and blameless in his generation. But in the Sumerian version, Ziusudra is saved because he's the carrier of something essential, the kingship that humanity needs to rebuild civilization after the deluge. Enki doesn't save Ziusudra to preserve one family. He saves him to preserve the institution of kingship itself, the knowledge, the authority, the divine me that allow humans to organize into cities rather than scattered tribes. And when the king list resumes after the flood, it repeats the formula. After the flood had swept over and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish, descended again, a second transfer, as if the flood had interrupted the original line, requiring the gods to re-establish kingship with a new dynasty. But the fact that Ziusudra survived, that he received immortality and divine favour, suggests continuity as well. The new kings of Kish could claim connection to the antediluvian line through Ziusudra, the bridge between the old world and the new. Later Mesopotamian tradition elaborates this idea through the concept of the Apkallu, the 7 sages who brought civilization to humanity before the flood, then continued their work afterward through human intermediaries. But that's a story for the next chapter. For now, what matters is recognizing the pattern. The Sumerians preserved detailed memory of pre-flood kings, documented their cities and succession, and treated the flood survivor not as lucky or merely righteous, but as the essential carrier of kingship, the one through whom the divine mandate too. Rule could be transmitted to the post-flood world. The numbers may be mythic, the cities may be legendary, but the function of the narrative is clear: to document continuity of legitimate authority across the greatest catastrophe in human memory, to demonstrate that the post-flood kings didn't invent kingship, they inherited it from fathers and grandfathers who inherited it from Ziusudra, who inherited it from the 8 antediluvian kings, who received it when it first descended from heaven in the city of Eridu at the beginning of time. Perhaps the massive reign lengths don't represent years at all. Perhaps they represent something else: the weight of authority, the depth of transmitted knowledge, the magnitude of responsibility these primordial kings carried. 8 individuals through whom civilization first flowed into human society. 8 bloodlines in 5 cities, holding something precious enough that the gods engineered its survival through apocalypse. The texts don't explain what made these 8 kings special. Why Alulim in Eridu? Why these specific names in this specific sequence? The selection criteria remain hidden, but the outcome is clear. After 241,200 years of encoded time, after catastrophe and renewal, kingship persisted, passed through the flood like seed in Ziusudra's boat, ready to grow again in the cities of Kish, Uruk, and Ur, ready to continue the line of chosen bloodlines. The Survivor Protocol. When the storm finally ceased, Ziusudra opened a window in the boat. Sunlight entered. In that first returning light, he could see the water's edge, a shoreline where there had been none before. The flood was receding. The Eridu Genesis preserves his first action. Ziusudra opened a window of the large boat. The sun god brought his rays into the interior of the large boat. Ziusudra, the king, prostrated himself before the sun god. Not panic, not relief, prostration, worship. The formal acknowledgement that he has been saved by divine intervention, that survival was not his achievement, but their gift. What follows is one of the most remarkable passages in Sumerian literature. An and Enlil gave to Ziusudra eternal life, like a god. Eternal breath from heaven they brought down for him. Then Ziusudra, the king, who preserved the seed of mankind at the time of the destruction of the living, they caused to dwell in the land of Dilmun, the place where the sun rises. 3 elements in this passage require attention. First, eternal life. Ziusudra doesn't merely survive the flood and die later. He's transformed, elevated to a status like a god. Immortality is conferred. The text uses the same language it uses for divine beings. Second, he preserved the seed of mankind. Not just himself, not just his family, but the seed, the continuity, the capacity for humanity to continue. This phrase appears in multiple flood narratives across Mesopotamian literature, always describing the survivor's function as preserver of seed. Third, he's relocated to Dilmun, a mythical paradise where the sun rises. He doesn't return to ordinary human society. He's removed to a liminal space, neither fully human nor fully divine, preserved as a bridge figure between the antediluvian world and the New Age. This pattern, the elevation of the flood survivor to semi-divine immortal status, appears in every Mesopotamian flood tradition with remarkable consistency across the languages and centuries. In the Atrahasis epic, composed in Akkadian around 1700 BC, the survivor is called Atrahasis, meaning exceedingly wise. The text is more complete than the Eridu Genesis and provides additional detail about why the gods sent the flood and why Ea Enki chose to save one human. According to Atrahasis, humans were created by mixing the blood of a slain god, Wee-Ilu, a god with intelligence, with clay. The goddess Belet-Ili, another name for Ninwald, formed 7 males and 7 females, establishing the first human bloodlines. These humans were created specifically to relieve the lesser gods of agricultural labour. Let the birth goddess create offspring, and let man assume the drudgery of God. Humanity multiplied. They filled the earth, and their noise, their clamour, their activity disturbed Enlil, king of the gods. The land became wide, the people became numerous. The land was bellowing like a bull. The god was disturbed by their uproar. Enlil heard their clamour and said to the great gods, "The clamour of mankind has become burdensome to me." Enlil attempts to reduce humanity's numbers through plague, drought and famine. Each time, Ea intervenes through his faithful human, Atrahasis, teaching him how to make offerings to specific gods who will relieve the crisis. Finally, Enlil decrees total destruction, a flood to annihilate humanity completely. The divine assembly agrees. But Ea cannot accept this. The text suggests his opposition is not sentimental, it's practical. Humanity was created to work. Without them, the gods will have to resume the burdensome labour themselves. So Ea speaks to Atrahasis through a reed wall, the same technique Enki uses in the Eridu-Genesis, warning him of the coming flood and instructing him to build a boat. Dismantle your house, build a boat, abandon riches and seek life. Hate possessions, save living things. Bring living seed of every kind into the boat. Atrahasis follows instructions precisely. He builds the boat, loads it with animals, his family, craftsmen to preserve skilled knowledge, and supplies. The flood comes, more terrible in Atrahasis than in other versions. For 7 days and 7 nights came the deluge, the storm pounded, the flood weapons smashed the people like a club. When it ends, Atrahasis makes offerings. The gods, who have been starving without human sacrifices, gather around the smoke like flies. Enlil is furious that someone survived. His plan to destroy humanity completely has been thwarted. But Ea defends his action. How could you irrationally have brought on the flood? Let the wrongdoer bear the penalty of his wrong. Let the criminal bear his crime. Yet be lenient. Let there not be a deluge. Instead of your bringing a flood, let lions rise up and diminish the people. Instead of your bringing a flood, let wolves rise up and diminish the people. Instead of your bringing a flood, let famine rise up and ravage the land. E's argument prevails. The gods agree to natural population control rather than total annihilation, and Atrahasis, along with his wife, is granted immortality and transported to a distant paradise. The Epic of Gilgamesh presents the same story through a different frame. Gilgamesh, seeking the secret of eternal life after the death of his friend Enkidu, journeys to the ends of the earth to find Utnapishtim, the Akkadian name for the flood survivor. When he finally reaches Utnapishtim's remote dwelling, Gilgamesh demands to know how a mortal man attained immortality. Utnapishtim responds by telling the flood story, essentially the same narrative as Atrahasis, though with minor variations. He describes the boat's construction, the loading of animals and craftsmen, the 7-day storm, the receding waters. When it ends, on Mount Nimush the boat landed. The mountain Nimush held the boat fast, allowing no motion. One day, a second day, Mount Nimush held the boat fast. When the 7th day arrived, I sent forth a dove, releasing it. The dove went away, but came back to me. There was no resting place, so it returned. I sent forth a swallow, releasing it. The swallow went away, but came back to me. There was no resting place, so it returned. I sent forth a raven, releasing it. The raven flew away, saw the waters receding, ate, circled, but did not return. This bird-sending sequence, so famous from the biblical Noah account, appears here in detail. The raven doesn't return because it finds land, evidence that the waters have truly receded. Utnapishtim makes sacrifices. Enlil arrives, still angry, but Ea intercedes. Finally, Enlil relents. Enlil came up into the boat. He took my hand and brought me out. He brought out my wife and had her kneel beside me. He touched our brows to bless us. In the past, Utnapishtim was a human being. Now Utnapishtim and his wife shall be like us, the gods. Utnapishtim shall dwell far away at the mouth of the rivers. The phrase mouth of the rivers refers to the same place the Eridu-Genesis calls Dilmun, a mythical location beyond the normal world. where the flood survivor lives in immortal isolation. When these three versions, Eridu-Genesis, Atrahasis, and Gilgamesh, are read together, a consistent protocol emerges. Phase 1. Crisis humanity has become too numerous/noisy. Divine assembly decides on destruction. Phase 2. Selection 1 human is chosen for survival, described as wise, righteous, or king. Phase 3. Warning the god Ea Enki circumvents the divine decision by warning the chosen one indirectly. Phase 4. Preservation: the survivor builds a boat, loads animals and seed, preserves the essential elements of civilization. Phase 5. Survival: 7 days and nights of flood. The boat lands on a mountain. Phase 6. Verification: birds are sent, sacrifices are made, gods are appeased. Phase 7. Elevation: the survivor and his wife receive immortality and are removed to a paradisal location. This isn't a story about random luck or simple divine favour. It's a protocol, a systematic procedure for preserving essential human bloodlines and knowledge through a catastrophic reset. Notice what's preserved: not just human bodies, but seed of all living things, craftsmen, the flood survivor's family, and in several versions tablets or written records of pre-flood wisdom. The Berossus account, written by a Babylonian priest around 280 BC and preserved in Greek translation, adds a crucial detail. Before the flood, the god commanded the survivor to write down the beginning, middle and end of all things, and bury the writing in the city of the sun in Sippar. After the flood, survivors were to dig up these writings and transmit the knowledge to humanity. This transforms the flood from natural disaster to intentional reset with built-in recovery protocol. Certain information must survive. Certain bloodlines must continue. The survivor isn't saved randomly. He's selected because he carries something essential that civilization cannot rebuild without. Later Mesopotamian tradition identifies the flood survivor with the last antediluvian sage, sometimes called Ziusudra, sometimes Atrahasis, sometimes Utnapishtim, but always the final link in the chain of pre-flood wisdom keepers. And this is where the Apkallu enter the narrative. According to Mesopotamian tradition, preserved in texts from the library of Ashurbanipal's 7th century, 7 sages, supernatural beings, part human and part fish, emerged from the sea before the flood to teach humanity the arts of civilization. The first and greatest was Adapa, also called Uan or Oannes. These Apkallu worked alongside the antediluvian kings, serving as advisors, teaching writing, mathematics, astronomy, law, and temple ritual. The tradition states that each of the first kings had an Apkallu sage as counsellor. Then came the flood. The Apkallu, being supernatural, didn't die, but after the flood, they no longer appeared in physical form. Instead, they worked through human successors, wise men who inherited their knowledge and continued their work in the new age. The flood survivor, then, represents the critical link. He's the last human to have direct contact with both the antediluvian kings and the Apkallu sages. He carries forward both the royal bloodline, Sing or King's Descent, and the transmitted wisdom having been taught by Ea Enki, who created the Apkallu. When kingship descended from heaven a second time after the flood, when the king list says it was established in Kish, it wasn't starting from zero. It was re-establishing what had existed before, transmitted through the survivor who had been deliberately preserved for precisely this purpose. The protocol suggests intentionality. Someone decided what must survive. Someone selected which human would carry the essential seed forward. Someone engineered continuity across catastrophe. The Sumerian texts don't hide this. They document it plainly. Certain bloodlines were chosen because those bloodlines carried what post-flood humanity would need to rebuild. Not superior genetics in the modern sense, but accumulated knowledge, transmitted authority, preserved wisdom, and perhaps, if we read the text as more than pure metaphor, some measurable quality that made these families capable of receiving and transmitting civilization itself. The flood wasn't meant to destroy all humanity, it was meant to reset civilization, to cull and refine, to preserve only those bloodlines that had proven their capacity to hold kingship. And when the waters receded, kingship descended once more, not to random survivors scratching out existence in the mud, but to the families who had been selected, trained, preserved, and prepared to lead humanity through the work of rebuilding. The protocol had worked. The seed survived. The bloodlines endured. And in the cities that rose after the deluge, the kings could trace their authority back through Ziusudra, through the 8 antediluvian rulers, to that first moment in Eridu when kingship descended from heaven and was given to Alulim, first among the chosen. The Apkallu transmission. Before humans knew how to write, how to build cities, how to dig canals or measure the stars, the 7 sages came from the sea. This is how Mesopotamian tradition remembers the origin of civilization, not as human invention, not as gradual discovery, but as teaching. Knowledge transmitted from beings who already possessed it to humans who needed to learn. The tradition appears in fragments across multiple sources, but the most complete account comes from Berossus, the Babylonian priest historian writing in Greek around 280 BCE. His works survive only in quotations by later authors, but those quotations preserve something remarkable. In the first year there appeared, from that part of the Erythraean Sea which borders upon Babylonia, an animal endowed with reason, by name Oannes. The whole body of the animal was like that of a fish, and had under a fish's head another head, and also feet below, similar to those of a man. This being in the daytime used to converse with men, but took no food at that season, and he gave them an insight into letters and sciences and arts of every kind. He taught them to construct cities, to found temples, to compile laws, and explained to them the principles of geometrical knowledge. He made them distinguish the seeds of the earth, and showed them how to collect the fruits. In short, he instructed them in everything which could tend to soften manners and humanize their lives. From that time, nothing material has been added by way of improvement to his instructions. Oannes is the Greek rendering of the Sumerian name Uan, identified with Adapa, the first of the Apkallu. The text is explicit. This being came from the sea, possessed both human and fish characteristics, and taught humans the complete foundation of civilized life. Not one skill at a time, but the entire package: writing, mathematics, astronomy, law, agriculture, architecture, temple ritual. And crucially, from that time, nothing material has been added by way of improvement to his instructions. The implication is stunning. Civilization wasn't invented. It was taught completely at the beginning. Earlier Mesopotamian sources confirm the tradition. A text from the library of Ashurbanipal lists the 7 Apkallu by name: Uan of Eridu, Uanduga of Bad Tabira, Emmaduga of Bad Tabira, Emmagalana of Bad Tabira, Emmabluga of Sippar, Aninlilda of Sippar, Utuabzu of Shurpak. Notice something: these sages are associated with the same 5 cities that appear in the antediluvian section of the Sumerian king list: Eridu, Bad Tabira, Sippar, Shurpak, the cities where the 8 kings ruled before the flood. The Apkallu weren't operating independently, they were working in conjunction with the antediluvian kings, serving as their advisors and counsellors. The text specifies they were carp men, whose forms were figures in the water. They're described as part human, part fish, beings of mixed nature, who could move between the realm of water, associated with Enki-E, the god of wisdom, and the realm of land, where humans dwell. After the flood, the tradition states, the Apkallu continued their work, but in modified form. They no longer appeared physically. Instead, they transmitted their knowledge through human successors, wise men who became scribes, priests, scholars, and royal advisors in the post-flood world. The transition is documented in ritual texts. Neo-Assyrian incantations invoke the Apkallu for protection and wisdom, describing them as the pure priests of the Apsu-Enki's underworld, who set up the plans for heaven and earth. The rituals place figurines of the Apkallu at the foundations of buildings to channel their protective power. But the most revealing text is the fragmentary story of Adapa himself, preserved on tablets from the library of Ashurbanipal and from the Elamana archive in Egypt 14th century text. The Adapa myth deserves close reading because it establishes the template for what the Apkallu transmitted to chosen human bloodlines. The text begins with Adapa's creation. In those days, in those years, the wise man, the sage among the Apkallu, created by Ea in Eridu, wide understanding he had perfected, disclosing the designs of the land. To him he gave wisdom, eternal life he did not give to him. Notice the phrase, Ea gave Adapa wisdom, but not eternal life. This is the first instance in human memory of the knowledge/mortality trade-off. Adapa receives superhuman intelligence, wide understanding, the ability to comprehend the designs of the land, but remains mortal. The story continues with Adapa serving as a priest in Eridu, providing fish for the temple offerings. One day while fishing, the south wind overturns his boat. In anger, Adapa breaks the wing of the south wind with a word. He curses it, and his curse has power. For 7 days, the wind doesn't blow. The sky god Anu notices and summons Adapa to heaven to explain himself. Adapa's creator and patron, warns him, when you stand before Anu, they will offer you food of death. Do not eat it. They will offer you water of death. Do not drink it. Adapa travels to heaven. But when Anu hears the full story, he's impressed rather than angry. Adapa demonstrates wisdom, restraint, and the ability to command natural forces through speech. Anu decides to reward him with immortality, offering him the food and water of life. But Adapa, following Ea's instructions, refuses. He doesn't eat or drink. Anu is puzzled. Why did you not eat? Why did you not drink? Will you not have eternal life? Alas for downtrodden mankind. Ea, my master, commanded me, you shall not eat, you shall not drink. Take him away and return him to his earth. Adapa returns to Eridu, still mortal. The opportunity for human immortality is lost, not through disobedience or sin, but through obedience to instructions that turned out to be wrong. The myth has puzzled scholars for over a century. Why would Ea, the god of wisdom, trick his own creation? Why prevent Adapa from receiving immortality? The most convincing interpretation. Ea understood something Anu didn't. If Adapa became immortal, he would leave the human realm permanently. He would become divine and no longer able to function as humanity's teacher and guide. Ea wanted Adapa to remain among humans, to preserve and transmit the wisdom he'd been given. By remaining mortal, Adapa establishes a lineage of wise mortals. He can teach, train successors, pass on his knowledge to human students who will continue the work after his death. Immortality would have ended the transmission. Mortality ensures its continuation. This is the function of the Apkallu, to preserve and transmit wisdom that originated with the gods, channeling it through specific human bloodlines capable of receiving and applying it. And here's where it connects to kingship. Multiple sources indicate that the antediluvian kings were advised by the Apkallu. The king exercised political authority while the sage provided wisdom and technical knowledge. The pairing created complete governance, power guided by understanding. After the flood, when the Apkallu no longer appeared physically, their function was absorbed by human officials. Kings began to claim wisdom as part of their divine mandate. Royal inscriptions describe kings receiving wisdom from Enki, just as Adapa had. The Apkallu's role was institutionalized within the royal bloodlines. Consider Enheduanna, high priestess of Ur, around 2300 BE. Daughter of Sargon of Akkad, she was appointed to the highest religious office in Sumer, a political appointment that merged royal blood with priestly authority. Enheduanna composed the first literary works ever signed by a named author, hymns to the goddess Inanna, and a collection of 42 temple hymns describing the sacred sites of Sumer. Her temple hymns document something fascinating. Each temple in each city preserves specific me, specific divine authorities and cosmic principles. The hymns catalogue what's held where, like an inventory of distributed knowledge. Together, the temples hold the complete set of civilizational information. Separately, each holds a piece. This suggests the post-flood world organised knowledge preservation differently than the antediluvian age. Instead of 7 Apkallu holding all wisdom, the wisdom was distributed across temple complexes, priestly families, and royal bloodlines. No single human held it completely as Adapa had, but collectively, the chosen bloodlines preserved the full transmission. In Heduanna's position, royal daughter and high priestess exemplifies this new model. She inherited political legitimacy through her father's bloodline and religious authority through appointment to Inanna's temple. She possessed literacy, astronomical knowledge, mathematical training, and theological understanding. She was, in effect, a post-flood Apkallu operating through human institutional structures. Later kings explicitly claimed descent from or connection to the Apkallu tradition. The Assyrian king Esarhaddon, 681-669, boasted that he was endowed with broad understanding like the sage Adapa. This wasn't poetic flourish, it was a claim to carry the same transmitted wisdom the first Apkallu had received from Ea. The pattern becomes clear. The Apkallu taught the antediluvian kings and their counsellors. When the flood came, that knowledge was preserved through the survivor protocol. Ziusudra carried it forward. After the flood, the knowledge was institutionalized within specific bloodlines. Royal families who held political authority and priestly families who held ritual and technical knowledge. These weren't random families. They were the ones who had been taught before the flood, who had preserved the teaching through catastrophe, and who continued the transmission afterward. The texts call them chosen because that's what they were, selected by the Apkallu on Ea's authority to receive, preserve, and apply the foundational wisdom that makes civilization possible. This is what descended from heaven, not abstract kingship, but a concrete package of knowledge, methodology, and governing capacity that required specific training to transmit. The bloodlines weren't genetically superior, they were pedagogically privileged, taught by teachers who possessed complete understanding of the designs of the land. And if Berossus is correct, if indeed nothing material has been added by way of improvement to his instructions, then post-flood civilization wasn't invention, it was restoration, the recovery and reapplication of what Uan and his 6 fellow Apkallu had taught in the beginning. The Sumerians documented this openly. They didn't claim to have invented writing, they said it was a gift from the gods. They didn't claim to have discovered mathematics, they said the Apkallu taught it. They didn't claim to have developed astronomy through observation, they said the stars' patterns were revealed to the antediluvian sages. Modern scholarship dismisses this as mythological false modesty or primitive attribution of human achievement to divine sources. But consider the alternative. What if the Sumerians were accurately reporting their own history? What if civilization did emerge suddenly, taught rather than invented, preserved through the flood, and restored by families who had received the transmission? The archaeological record shows civilization appearing rapidly in Sumer around 3500 BCE. Within a few centuries, fully developed cities with writing, mathematics, monumental architecture, and complex administration. Not gradual evolution, sudden fluorescence. The Sumerian explanation, the knowledge, already existed. It was taught before the flood. After the flood, the chosen bloodlines, those who had been trained by the Apkallu and survived through Ziusudra, re-established what had been lost. They restored the cities in the same locations. They rebuilt the temples. They transmitted the me that Inanna had brought from Eridu to Uruk. They did what the Apkallu had taught them to do, preserve the seed through catastrophe, then replant it when the waters receded. And kingship, Namlugal, was part of that seed, not invented in Kish after the flood, restored in Kish, descending from heaven a second time, finding new carriers in the bloodlines that had proven their capacity to hold it. The 7 sages came from the sea at the beginning. They taught everything. They established the pattern. They selected which humans could bear the weight of that knowledge. And when the flood swept them away, the knowledge remained, carried forward in clay tablets, buried in Sippar, in oral traditions preserved by priestly families, in the bloodlines of the 8 antediluvian kings, in the boat where Ziusudra held the seed of all living things. The Apkallu's work was complete. The transmission was secure. The chosen bloodlines would carry civilization forward, generation after generation, preserving what had been given in the beginning when kingship first descended from heaven, the first chosen daughter. In the ruins of the temple complex at Ur, archaeologists discovered a circular disc of white calcite, roughly 9 inches in diameter. On its face, carved in relief, appears a woman in ceremonial robes standing before an altar. Behind her, a figure pours a libation. Above, an inscription in cuneiform identifies her, Enheduanna, Ziru priestess, wife of the god Nanna, daughter of Sargon, king of the world, in the temple of the goddess Inanna. The disc dates to approximately 2300 BCE. It depicts the first author in human history whose name we know, not through later attribution or scholarly guess, but through her own signature on the works she composed. Enheduanna was not a poet who happened to come from a royal family. She was a deliberate political appointment, a merging of bloodlines and authority that reveals how the post-flood world organised the transmission of divine knowledge through institutional structures. Her father, Sargon of Akkad, rose from obscure origins to conquer all of Sumer and Akkad, creating the world's first empire. The legends surrounding his birth echo the flood survivor motif. He was found as an infant floating in a reed basket on the Euphrates, discovered by a gardener raised in humble circumstances, like Moses. Like Ziusudra's preservation in a boat, the pattern of the chosen one preserved through water destined for kingship. Sargon faced a fundamental problem. How do you legitimize an empire built through conquest rather than inherited through established dynasties? How do you claim the Namlugal that had descended from heaven to the ancient cities of Sumer when you're an outsider, an Akkadian, a military upstart? His solution was brilliant and reveals deep understanding of how Mesopotamian legitimacy functioned. He appointed his daughter Enheduanna to the highest religious office in Sumer, the on-priestess of Nanna in Ur, one of the most ancient and sacred positions in the civilization. The word En designated a particular kind of priest or priestess who served as the earthly spouse of a deity. The En didn't merely perform rituals, they embodied the divine human connection. They were, in effect, the city's mediator with its patron god. In Ur, the En priestess was considered the wife of Nanna, the moon god, and lived in the temple complex, performing sacred rites that ensured the city's prosperity. By appointing his daughter to this position, Sargon accomplished several things simultaneously. First, he merged his bloodline with the most ancient religious authority in Sumer. Enheduanna carried royal blood through her father and divine authority through her office. Her children, though we have no record she had any, would have been both royal descendants and temple bred, trained in the sacred traditions. Second, he gained legitimate claim to the Me of Ur. Remember the Inanna and Enki myth. Divine authority could be transferred between cities. By placing his daughter as Nanna's wife, Sargon effectively married his dynasty into Ur's divine household. The Me that Ur possessed now served his empire. Third, he created a precedent for royal daughters as religious leaders. After Enheduanna, appointing princesses to high priestess positions became standard practice for Mesopotamian kings seeking to consolidate power and legitimize new dynasties. But Enheduanna was more than a political pawn. The texts she composed reveal a woman of extraordinary learning and literary skill. Her most famous work, The Exaltation of Inanna, is a 153-line hymn composed in Sumerian. The poem documents a political crisis. Enheduanna was apparently expelled from the temple by a rebel named Lugalan, who challenged Sargon's authority. In the poem, she appeals directly to the goddess Inanna for restoration, that I have appeared triumphant, be it known to him who drove me from my temple. Like a swallow he made me fly from the window, my life is consumed. He made me walk in the bramble of the mountain. He stripped me of the crown appropriate to the high priesthood. He gave me dagger and sword. It becomes you, he said to me. The poem works on multiple levels simultaneously. It's a political document, recording an actual historical event. It's a theological argument, demonstrating Inanna's power by appealing for her intervention. It's a literary masterwork, using sophisticated metaphor and parallel structure. And it's a magical incantation. The text was copied and recopied for 500 years after Enheduanna's death, used in rituals, suggesting it was believed to carry actual power. Eventually, according to the poem, Inanna intervenes. Enheduanna is restored. Lugalan is defeated. The poem ends with a hymn of praise affirming Inanna's supreme power and Enheduanna's rightful position as her priestess. This wasn't merely personal vindication, it was proof of concept. Enheduanna demonstrated that she possessed legitimate divine authority. The goddess answered her appeal, confirmed her priesthood, defeated her enemy. The divine selection was verified through results. Her second major work, The Hymn to Inanna, explores the goddess's multiple natures: warrior, lover, bringer of justice, destroyer of the wicked. The text reveals deep theological knowledge, documenting Inanna's various me and cosmic functions. It reads like a technical manual of divine power disguised as poetry. But perhaps most revealing is her third major composition, a collection of 42 hymns, one for each of the major temples of Sumer and Akkad. These temple hymns catalogue the sacred geography of Mesopotamia, noting which deity resides in which temple, what me each location holds, what functions each performs in the cosmic order. Consider what this represents: a complete map of how divine authority was distributed across the empire. Each hymn notes the temple's name, its deity, its particular powers, and its relationship to other temples in the network. Together, they function as an index to the civilization's preserved knowledge. The first hymn addresses the temple of Enlil at Nippur, House of Enlil, which gives light to all the lands. Great mountain, in the pure place founded. House, mountain in heaven and earth, which the great prince has fixed. House, the lofty platform of which reaches the sky. The 50th hymn describes the temple of Inanna at Uruk, house, seven-mouthed dragon, which lays many ambushes like a leopard, destroying the enemy land. Great storehouse, storeroom of the gods. With your lofty battle might, you have caused terror to fall over all lands. Each temple is distinct. Each holds specific authority. Together, they preserve the complete set of divine powers governing reality. This catalogue suggests something important. Post-flood civilization distributed knowledge preservation across multiple centres rather than concentrating it in one location or one family. Each temple city specialised. Eridu held the wisdom of Enki. Ur held the astronomical knowledge of Nanna. Uruk held Inanna's martial and sexual me. Nippur held Enlil's supreme political authority. Enheduanna, through her hymns, documented this distributed network. And by documenting it, she preserved it, ensuring future generations would know where each piece of civilization's puzzle was kept. This is what royal priestesses did. They served as nodes in the knowledge transmission network. They were trained in reading, writing, mathematics, astronomy, theology, and history. They had access to temple libraries containing the oldest tablets. They oversaw the training of junior scribes and priests. They performed rituals that encoded seasonal astronomy, when to plant, when to harvest, when floods would come. They composed literary works that preserved cultural memory. They were, in essence, the institutionalized successors to the Apkallu, human teachers carrying forward the civilizational wisdom that had been transmitted before the flood. And they were chosen based on bloodline. Not any woman could become an end priestess of Nana. The position required royal birth, extensive education from childhood, proven literacy, and crucially, the demonstration that the deity accepted you. Omens had to be favourable. Dreams had to confirm selection. The goddess or god had to, in the perception of the priestly establishment, approve. This selection process ensured continuity of standards. You couldn't fake your way into high priesthood. You had to demonstrate actual competence in the knowledge domains the position required. And competence came through years of training, which came through access to education, which came through royal bloodline. Enheduanna's appointment set a pattern that lasted for centuries. In the Ur III period, 1-2000, every king appointed his daughter as priestess in Ur. The position became so important that we can partially reconstruct the dynasty's chronology based on the succession of priestesses documented in administrative texts. One such priestess, Enanadu, daughter of King Shulki, served for 64 years. Another, Enanatuma, served for 35 years. These weren't ceremonial figureheads. They managed vast temple estates, oversaw hundreds of workers, controlled significant wealth, and wielded religious authority that sometimes exceeded their father's political power. They also, crucially, trained the next generation. Junior priestesses learned by serving under senior ones. Scribal students copied ancient texts under priestly supervision. The knowledge was transmitted person to person, teacher to student, generation to generation. This is how bloodlines were chosen in the post-flood world, not through miraculous divine intervention, but through systematic education within families that had preserved access to knowledge across generations. Enheduanna could compose in both Sumerian and Akkadian, two unrelated languages requiring completely different grammatical training. She could write complex poetry following strict metrical and stylistic rules. She understood theology well enough to compose authoritative hymns that would be copied for centuries. She performed astronomical observations to time temple festivals correctly. She managed economic resources and supervised construction projects. Where did she learn all this? From teachers in the temple who had been taught by their teachers, stretching back through generations of preserved instruction. From the library tablets stored in Ur's temple containing texts composed centuries earlier. From her status as chosen daughter of a king who himself claimed divine favour and appointment. The bloodline didn't give her supernatural ability, it gave her access. Access to education, to teachers, to texts, to training from childhood in the knowledge domains required for civilizational preservation. And when she signed her name to her compositions, Enheduanna, priestess, wife of the god Nana, daughter of Sargon, she was documenting that bloodline, establishing that she possessed legitimate authority to speak on theological matters, to compose liturgical texts, to map the sacred geography of the empire. She was chosen, not randomly, not by genetic lottery, but through the intersection of royal bloodline, her father's conquest and claim to kingship, and demonstrated competence, her education, her compositions, her goddess's confirmation of her priesthood. The disc found at Ur depicts her at the moment of that confirmation. She stands before the altar, performing the rite. The goddess accepts her offering. The divine selection is complete, and through her hymns, through the copies made by generations of scribes, through the institutional structure she helped establish, the knowledge transmission continued. From the Apkallu, who taught the antediluvian kings, through Ziusudra, who survived the flood, through the restored dynasties of Kish and Uruk and Ur, through Sargon, who conquered and Enheduanna, who documented, and the priestesses who followed her, the chosen bloodlines preserved what needed to be preserved, not because their blood was different, but because they were positioned, trained, tested, and confirmed as capable of carrying the weight. The first chosen daughter understood this. She wrote it plainly in her exhortation of Inanna, "You are the queen of all the great divine powers. Not you gave me special genetics, but you confirmed my authority to channel the divine powers that govern civilization. Authority descended from heaven. Knowledge was transmitted through teaching. Bloodlines preserved both across generations. And a woman whose name means ornament of heaven, daughter of a conqueror, wife of a god, first author of record, documented it all in texts that would outlast her empire, her city, and her civilization, so that we, 4,000 years later, could read her words and understand the chosen bloodlines were real, and they were chosen not for superiority, but for responsibility, knowledge as inheritance. The Adapa myth poses a question that echoes across 4,000 years. Why would the god of wisdom deliberately prevent his wisest creation from achieving immortality? We encountered this story earlier when discussing the Apkallu, but it deserves deeper examination because it establishes the template for how knowledge was understood to transfer across generations in Mesopotamian thought. Adapa, created by Enki, was given wide understanding and taught the designs of the land. The text specifies, "To him he gave wisdom, eternal life he did not give to him." This isn't an oversight. It's an intentional division. Wisdom fully given, immortality withheld. When Adapa travels to heaven, and Anu offers him the bread and water of eternal life, Ea has already warned him, "They will offer you food of death, do not eat. They will offer you water of death, do not drink." Adapa obeys. He refuses immortality. Anu is confused. Why would Ea give his creation the wrong instructions? The text preserves Anu's frustration. Why did you not eat? Why did you not drink? Will you not have eternal life? Alas for downtrodden mankind. The phrase "alas for downtrodden mankind" suggests Anu recognizes something tragic has occurred. Humanity had a chance at immortality, the chance Adapa represented, and it's now lost. Because of Ea's instructions. Because Adapa obeyed his creator rather than accepting Anu's gift. Traditional interpretation reads this as a full narrative, similar to Genesis. Humanity loses immortality through a trick or test. But that reading misses something crucial. Ea is the god of wisdom. He doesn't make mistakes. If he tells Adapa not to eat, there must be a reason more profound than simple error or deception. The key lies in understanding what Adapa represents. He's not just the first wise human, he's the first of the Apkallu, the prototype for all the sages who would teach civilization to humanity. His function isn't to become a god. His function is to remain among humans as their teacher. If Adapa had eaten the bread of life and drunk the water of life, he would have become immortal. He would have joined the divine assembly permanently. He would have left the human realm. And who then would have taught humanity? Who would have transmitted the wide understanding and knowledge of the designs of the land that Ea had given him? Ea understood the transmission requires mortality. An immortal teacher would either abandon humanity to dwell with gods, or would become so remote from human experience across millennia that he could no longer effectively teach mortal students. But a mortal teacher, even one with extraordinary wisdom, remains human, experiences human limitations, understands what humans need to know because he shares their condition. And crucially, a mortal teacher must train successors. He knows he will die. Therefore, he must pass on what he knows. He must establish a lineage of teaching. This is the pattern Adapa establishes. Wisdom given fully, immortality withheld, creating the necessity for transmission across generations. The text continues with Adapa returning to Eridu, where he serves as priest and sage. Later Mesopotamian tradition identifies him as the first of 7 antediluvian Apkallu who taught humanity before the flood. Each Apkallu worked with one of the antediluvian kings, serving as advisor and teacher. After the flood, the Apkallu tradition continued, but in modified form. No longer supernatural fishmen emerging from the sea, but human sages who inherited the role and the knowledge. The transition is documented in ritual texts. After the flood, the Apkallu became human. They were chosen from among humanity to continue the teaching, chosen, not random. Specific humans selected to inherit the Apkallu function, to preserve and transmit the wisdom that Ea had originally given to Adapa. How was this selection made? What qualified someone to become a post-flood sage? The texts provide hints. In a composition known as the Ballad of Early Rulers, there appears a list of legendary wise men who served as counsellors to early kings. These included Adapa of Eridu, Uanduga of Bard Tibira, Enmaduga of Bard Tibira, several others, each associated with one of the antediluvian cities. Then, after noting these prediluvial sages, the text continues, and after the flood swept over, when kingship was brought down from heaven, when kingship descended again, there were sages, wise scribes, who knew everything. The phrasing is precise, sages, who knew everything, not who were learning or who discovered, but who knew, past tense, completed knowledge, as if the knowing had been transferred intact rather than accumulated gradually. This suggests post-flood sages were trained by those who had preserved pre-flood knowledge. The transmission continued through Ziusudra or other survivors who had been taught before the catastrophe. The new sages didn't reinvent astronomy, mathematics or writing. They were taught by teachers who already possessed these arts. The mechanism of teaching appears repeatedly in Mesopotamian literature as father-to-son instruction. The form is so common it became a literary genre, the wisdom dialogue between aged sage and his student or son. The instructions of Shurupak preserves one such text. Shurupak, the last antediluvian city where Ubaratutu/Ziusudra ruled before the flood, is where the wise Shurupak, the city snake, instructs his son Ziusudra. In those days, in those far remote days, in those nights, in those faraway nights, in those years, in those far remote years, at that time, the wise one who knew how to speak with elaborate words lived in the land. Shurupak, the wise one who knew how to speak with elaborate words, lived in the land. The text continues with practical and moral advice. Don't vouch for someone or you'll be held responsible. Don't break into a house. Don't murder. Don't speak arrogantly. When making judgment, consider carefully. But interspersed with practical ethics are more mysterious instructions. The wise one spoke these words. He gave advice to his son. The son accepted what his father had commanded. The emphasis isn't on the content of individual proverbs. It's on the act of transmission itself. Father teaches son. Son accepts and preserves. The wisdom passes intact across the generation gap. This pattern, knowledge as inheritance, explains why bloodlines mattered so much in Mesopotamian kingship. If wisdom must be taught across decades from master to student, then the student must have access to the master. The royal prince raised in the palace, educated from childhood by court sages, trained in the scribal arts, given access to the library tablets, he inherits knowledge his subjects cannot. This isn't supernatural, it's systematic education within elite families. The advice to a prince is another wisdom text, this one explicitly about how kings should rule. It presents kingship as learned skill requiring specific knowledge. If a king does not heed justice, his people will be thrown into chaos, his land will be devastated. If he does not heed the justice of his land, king of destinies, will alter his destiny. If he listens to his advisors who speak with elaborate words, his land will revolt against him. Notice the emphasis on learning and listening. The king must heed justice. He must be taught what justice is and how to implement it. He must listen to advisors carefully, distinguishing true wisdom from empty rhetoric. These are skills acquired through training, not innate qualities. The text continues with warnings about specific failures. If a king imposes excessive forced labour, the land will revolt. If he ignores the grievances of his people, gods will bring enemies against him. If he allows the temple estates to be plundered, his throne will be overturned. Each warning assumes the king has been taught the proper procedures. The text functions as a manual, a condensed version of what the prince should have learned during his education. It's meant to be memorized, internalized, applied. This is knowledge as inheritance, the accumulated understanding of how to govern, how to make justice prevail, how to balance the competing demands of temples and merchants and farmers and soldiers, all encoded in texts that princes study and sages preserve. The library of Ashurbanipal, excavated from Nineveh in the 19th century, contained over 30,000 tablets, spanning every domain of Mesopotamian knowledge, royal inscriptions, literary epics, mathematical tables, astronomical observations, medical texts, omens, rituals, word lists, bilingual dictionaries. This wasn't a random collection, it was a deliberate archive, an attempt to gather in one place all the knowledge necessary for civilization to function. Ashurbanipal himself boasted in his inscriptions, "I learnt the craft of the sage Adapa, the secret knowledge of all scribal craft. I can recognize celestial and terrestrial portents and can discuss them in the assembly of scholars. I am able to find the solution to complicated divisions and multiplications that are difficult to compute." He's not claiming supernatural wisdom. He's documenting his education. He was trained in the scribal arts. He learned to read both Sumerian dead language by his time and Akkadian. He studied mathematics, astronomy, and divination. He had access to teachers and texts that ordinary subjects didn't. His bloodline, as grandson of Sennacherib, gave him that access. He inherited the throne, yes, but more importantly, he inherited the opportunity to be taught, to receive the accumulated knowledge that Mesopotamian civilization had preserved for 2,000 years by his time. And when he gathered those tablets into his library, he was ensuring the next generation could inherit the same knowledge. He was doing what Adapa had done, what the Apkallu had done, what Ziusudra had done, preserving the seed so civilization could continue. The Adapa myth established the principle, wisdom is not innate, it's transmitted. And transmission requires teachers who will die, creating urgency to teach and necessity to learn. Immortal teachers would have no urgency. Mortal teachers know time is limited. They must compress and encode their knowledge, find apt students, verify the transmission succeeded. This is why Ea withheld immortality from Adapa, not as punishment, as design. To create a system where knowledge would be inherited rather than hoarded, where each generation must prove worthy to receive what the previous generation preserved. The chosen bloodlines weren't biologically special. They were pedagogically privileged, positioned to receive intensive teaching from childhood, trained in domains most people never accessed, given responsibility to preserve and transmit. But privilege requires proof. Enheduanna had to actually compose great works to validate her priesthood. Ashurbanipal had to actually learn the scribal arts to claim Adapa's wisdom. Gilgamesh had to actually demonstrate wisdom and strength to fulfill his 2/3 divine potential. Bloodline gave access. But competence had to be demonstrated. Knowledge had to be applied. The inheritance wasn't automatic. It was conditional on actually learning what the teachers taught. And what they taught was everything Ea had given Adapa at the beginning: wide understanding, knowledge of the designs of the land, the skills necessary to make civilization function across generations despite catastrophe, conquest, and the inevitable mortality of individual kings and sages. Wisdom as inheritance, mortality as motivation, teaching as sacred duty, learning as proof of selection. This is what descended from heaven with kingship, not magic, but method. The knowledge of how to rule justly, organize labour, predict seasons, record events, teach successors, knowledge that required decades to transmit, which is why it had to remain within families who had the resources to support long education. Adapa sacrificed immortality so his wisdom wouldn't die with him. And because of that sacrifice, repeated across countless mortal sages and kings, the knowledge survived. Survived the flood, survived the fall of dynasties, survived the collapse of empires, survived into clay tablets we can still read 4,000 years later, learning what Adapa learned when Ea first gave him wisdom and set him the task of teaching humanity. The chosen bloodlines were the teaching lineages, and they were chosen because they chose, generation after generation, to preserve what they'd been given rather than let it die. That was the inheritance. That was the selection. That was why certain families led humanity, because they remembered what needed to be remembered and taught what needed to be taught so civilization could continue. The procedures of legitimacy. Around 2100 BC, a governor of Uruk named Ur-Namma staged a successful revolt against the last king of the Gutian occupation. The Gutians, a highland people from the Zagros Mountains, had controlled southern Mesopotamia for about a century after the collapse of the Akkadian Empire. Now Ur-Namma swept them aside and founded the third dynasty of Ur, ushering in what historians call the Sumerian Renaissance. He faced an immediate problem: legitimacy. He was a military victor, yes. He controlled the cities through force, yes. But force alone didn't constitute legitimate kingship in Mesopotamian understanding. He needed to demonstrate that Namlugal, kingship itself, had descended to him, that he was chosen, not merely successful. His solution is documented across multiple inscriptions, hymns, and administrative texts. He constructed a comprehensive legitimation narrative that became the model for how later kings would justify their rule. First, Ur-Namma claimed divine selection. His royal hymns state, "When the god Nana, lord of the city, lifted his gaze upon me, when he made my name resound in Sumer and Akkad, at that time, in the great assembly, Nana called me by name." The language is precise. Nana didn't merely favour Ur-Namma, he called him by name, the formula indicating explicit selection for a specific role. This echoes the language used for Adapa, called him by Nark. For Moses, God called to him from the burning bush. For prophets and kings throughout ancient Near Eastern literature, to be called by name meant formal appointment to office. Second, Ur-Namma claimed descent from legendary kings. He commissioned texts connecting his lineage to Gilgamesh, Lugalbanda, and the divine Ninsun. The genealogy is likely partly fictional. 2 centuries separated Ur-Namma from the Uruk kings he claimed as ancestors. But the claim mattered because it established bloodline continuity with the rulers who possessed undisputed legitimacy. Third, he appointed his daughter Enenadu as empriestess of Nana in Ur, following the precedent Sargon had established with Enheduanna. This merged his bloodline with the most ancient religious office in the city, giving his family institutional control over both political and sacred authority. Fourth, and most remarkably, Ur-Namma promulgated a law code. The Code of Ur-Namma is the oldest known law collection, predating Hammurabi's famous code by 3 centuries. Its prologue establishes Ur-Namma's legitimacy by documenting what he achieved after receiving kingship. Then did Ur-Namma, the mighty warrior, king of Ul, king of Sumer and Akkad, by the might of Namma, lord of the city, and in accordance with the true word of Utu, establish equity in the land. He banished malediction, violence, and strife. The code continues with specific laws, standardizing weights and measures, protecting widows and orphans from exploitation, fixing prices, punishing theft and murder. These aren't random decrees, they're the application of me, specifically the me of justice and judgment that Inanna had taken from Eridu to Uruk, that Ur-Namma now claimed to exercise. The procedure is clear. To legitimize his kingship, Ur-Namma had to demonstrate that he possessed and could properly apply the divine powers lide, that constitute legitimate rule. He had to show results, equity established, justice enacted, cosmic order maintained. This pattern, claim divine selection, demonstrate bloodline connection, merge with religious authority, prove competence through results, became standard procedure for Mesopotamian kings seeking to legitimize rule. Ur-Nama's son Shulgi took it further. Shulgi ruled for 48 years, 2094-2047 BC, and produced more royal inscriptions than any other Mesopotamian king. His self-legitimation campaign is exhaustingly thorough and reveals exactly what qualities Mesopotamian civilization believed legitimate kings must possess. Shulgi commissioned dozens of hymns praising himself. Modern readers find this off-putting, but these weren't mere vanity projects. They were documentary evidence of competence. Consider Shulgi Hymn A, in which the king catalogues his abilities. I, Shulgi, the noble king, have been blessed with a favourable destiny from the womb. When I was small, I was at the academy, where I learnt the scribal art on tablets of Sumer and Akkad. Among the high-born, no one could write like me. I acquired knowledge of arithmetic, of calculation. I learnt the singer's art, mastered every kind of musical instrument. I learned to debate in the great courtyard and was wise in decisions. I excelled in the art of wrestling, and no one could cast me down. He continues, claiming expertise in archery. Running, he allegedly ran the 100-mile distance between Nippur and Ur in a single day. Chariot driving, weaponry, hunting, and, crucially, making wise judicial decisions. This isn't random boasting. It's a checklist of royal competencies. A legitimate king must be literate, can read the old tablets, numerate Desan's accounting and taxation, musically trained and perform temple ritual, wise in debate and make legal judgments, physically capable and lead the army and hunt. Each skill has practical application in governance. Shulgi also claimed divine parentage. In multiple hymns he calls Ninsun his mother, placing himself in Gilgamesh's bloodline. Ninsun, the great queen, bore me in the Anna temple. I, Shulgi, was given a favourable destiny in the mountains where the sun rises. Whether this was literally believed or functioned as metaphorical claim to inherited wisdom, it served a legitimation purpose. Shulgi possessed the same partial divinity that Gilgamesh had possessed. Therefore, he could rule with the same authority. He also documented his restoration of ancient temples, his provision of justice, his military victories, his economic reforms. Each achievement proved he possessed the mean necessary for kingship. He wasn't merely claiming divine appointment, he was demonstrating it through measurable results. The climax of Shulgi's legitimation came late in his reign, when he declared himself divine. Inscriptions begin referring to him with the Dingir symbol, the divine Shulgi. Temples made offerings to him. Priests invoked his name in prayers. This wasn't megalomania, or not only, it was the logical conclusion of the legitimation process. If kingship descended from heaven, if legitimate kings possessed divine blood through descent from Gilgamesh and Ninsun, if royal competence came from transmitted wisdom originating with the gods, then a king who demonstrated all these qualities, who ruled justly for decades, who expanded the empire and restored the temples, could legitimately claim to have become divine himself. Deification was the ultimate proof that the king had been properly chosen. The gods wouldn't allow a false king to claim divinity. Cosmic order would revolt against such presumption. But if the claim succeeded, if the temples accepted it, if the people prospered under his rule, then the deification itself proved legitimacy. Shulgi's grandson Shu-Sin continued the pattern, and his successor Ibisin attempted the same. But Ibisin faced a crisis that tested the entire legitimation system. In Ibisin's 14th year of rule, round 2018, the empire began collapsing. Provinces rebelled, foreign invaders pressed from all sides, famine struck. The administrative tablets from his reign document growing chaos, governors refusing to send tribute, cities declaring independence, messengers unable to travel because roads were controlled by enemies. Ibn Sin desperately appealed to the gods. His inscriptions document increasingly frantic ritual activity, new temple dedications, attempts to demonstrate continued divine favour, but nothing worked. Within 10 years, fell to Elamite invaders. The city was sacked, the temples burned, the king captured and deported. The collapse of III posed a theological crisis. If kingship descended from heaven, if the dynasty had been legitimately chosen, if Shulgi had been properly deified, why did the dynasty fall? Why did the gods allow their chosen bloodline to be defeated? A composition known as the Lament for grapples with this question. The text is a long poem describing Ur's destruction in graphic detail, enemy soldiers desecrating temples, civilians massacred in streets, sacred groves cut down. The goddess Ningal, wife of Nana, laments, "My city which no longer exists, I am no longer its mistress. Nana, my house which no longer exists, I am no longer its lady. My possessions are scattered, I am no longer there." The lament doesn't blame Ibn Sin for incompetence or sin, it blames the divine assembly. Enlil, king of the gods, decided to destroy The other gods tried to intercede, but Enlil's decision stood. Nana himself couldn't save his own city. Why? The text provides an answer that's simultaneously theological and political. Enlil made the kingship of disappear. He made her people be scattered. Enlil changed the behaviour of the nation, yet the nation did not cease, and its word did not decay. The nation, the Sumerian people, survived. The civilization continued. Only the dynasty fell. Kingship moved elsewhere, descending from heaven to a new city, to a new dynasty, continuing the pattern established at the beginning. This interpretation allowed Mesopotamian civilization to maintain faith in the legitimacy system despite political catastrophe. Dynasties could fall. That was expected. Kingship moved between cities regularly. The king list documented it happening dozens of times. But the institution of kingship, the Nam Lugal itself, persisted. It descended to new recipients when the gods decided the previous holders had failed or fulfilled their purpose. The kings of Essene, who succeeded Ur III, immediately began their own legitimation process. They claimed to be restoring what Ur had lost. They traced genealogies back to Ur-Namma. They appointed priestesses to the same temples. They copied and studied the old texts, including Shulgi's hymns. They were demonstrating that they had inherited the legitimate authority, that kingship had descended to them according to the proper procedures. This cycle continued for centuries. Each new dynasty had to prove legitimacy through the same procedures, claim divine selection, demonstrate bloodline connection, or create one through genealogical claims and marriages, merge with religious institutions, prove competence through just rule. The procedures weren't foolproof. Military conquerors could seize power and then construct legitimacy afterward, as Sargon and Ur-Namma had done. But they couldn't rule effectively without completing the legitimation process. Their subjects wouldn't accept orders from an unauthorized king. The scribes wouldn't copy his inscriptions into the permanent record. The priests wouldn't make offerings. The temples wouldn't surrender their resources. Legitimate authority required recognition by the institutional structures that preserved civilization. And those structures demanded proof that the king had received kingship properly, that it had descended from heaven through the established bloodlines via the recognized procedures. This is why genealogy mattered so much, why kings spent enormous resources commissioning inscriptions documenting their lineages, why royal marriages were carefully arranged to merge bloodlines with existing legitimacy, why priestesses from royal families became crucial nodes in the knowledge transmission network. The chosen bloodlines were chosen not once, but continuously. Each generation had to prove worthy, had to demonstrate competence, had to receive recognition from the institutions preserving civilization. The bloodlines that succeeded were those that understood they didn't own kingship. they held it in trust, inherited from ancestors, responsible to transmit it properly to descendants. Ur-Namma understood this. His law code, his temple restorations, his administrative reforms, all were efforts to prove he deserved the kingship that had descended to him. Shulgi understood this. His exhaustive documentation of his skills, his decades of just rule, his ultimate deification, all were demonstrations that he had fulfilled the requirements. Even Ibn Sin, whose dynasty collapsed, followed the procedures. He failed not because he was illegitimate, but because cosmic order had decided to move kingship elsewhere. The gods had made their decision. Another bloodline would carry the burden. This is what the procedures of legitimacy reveal. Kingship wasn't permanent. It was conditional. It required proof, demonstration, results. The chosen bloodlines had to remain chosen, generation after generation, by continuing to do what their ancestors had done: preserve knowledge, apply wisdom, maintain justice, transmit the inheritance. Those who failed lost their cities, their thrones, their dynasties. But kingship itself persisted, descending from heaven to new recipients, continuing the chain that had begun in Eridu when Alulim first received the name Lugal and began humanity's long experiment with civilized governance. The procedures were strict, but they served a purpose, ensuring that only those bloodlines capable of bearing the weight, trained to apply the wisdom, committed to the transmission, only those would lead humanity forward. And the clay tablets documenting those procedures survived, 4,000 years later, still teaching us what the Sumerians understood about authority, inheritance, and the responsibility that comes with being chosen. The patterns across time. When the tablets are laid side by side, the Sumerian king list next to the Eridu Genesis, the Atrahasis fragments beside the Gilgamesh flood account, Adappa's story alongside Enheduanna's hymns, patterns emerge that transcend individual texts. The patterns are too consistent to be coincidental, too specific to be mere cultural motifs. They appear across different time periods, in different languages, Merian and Akkadian, from different cities, composed for different purposes. Yet they tell the same story from multiple angles. Let's trace them systematically. Pattern 1. The divine origin of kingship. This appears in the Sumerian king list, when kingship descended from heaven, temple hymns invoking gods who grant the sceptre of kingship. Royal inscriptions, the god called me, chose me, gave me the throne. The Inanna and Enki myth, kingship as a me that can be transferred. The Tablet of Destinies narratives, legitimate authority requires divine bestowal. The language varies, but the core claim remains identical. Political authority originates with gods, not humans. Legitimate kings receive kingship, they don't create it. Pattern 2. Pre-flood civilization with impossible chronology. This appears in Sumerian king list, 8 kings ruling 241,200 years. Eridu Genesis, cities and kingship established before the flood. Barossa's detailed history of 10 antediluvian kings with elaborated reigns. Genesis 5:10. Patriarchs from Adam to Noah with extraordinary lifespans. Various Greek traditions of pre-cataclysm golden ages. The specific numbers differ across traditions, but all agree civilization existed before a catastrophic flood, rulers lived extraordinarily long lives, and this prediluvial period requires special chronological treatment. Pattern 3. The chosen survivor. This appears in Eridu Genesis, Ziusudra warned, builds boat, preserves seed, receives immortality. Atrahasis warned, builds boat, preserves animals / craftsman, becomes immortal. Gilgamesh Utnapishtim warned, builds boat, survives flood, relocates to paradise. Genesis 6:9, Noah warned, builds ark, preserves animal pairs, receives divine covenant. Numerous flood myths worldwide with single righteous survivor. Across all versions, one human is selected for survival, warned by divine figure, preserves essential elements of civilization, receives reward for obedience. Pattern 4. Wisdom as divine gift, not human discovery. This appears in Adappa myth, Ea gives wisdom directly. Apkallu tradition, supernatural teachers from the sea transmit all civilizational arts. Royal inscriptions, kings claim wisdom from Enki. The instructions texts, wisdom passed father, to son as sacred inheritance. Prometheus myth in Greek tradition, fire knowledge as stolen gift from gods. Civilization isn't portrayed as gradual human invention, but as complete package transmitted from supernatural divine sources to chosen humans. Pattern 5. Hybrid divine human figures. This appears in Gilgamesh, explicitly 2/3 divine, 1/3 human. Lugalbanda and other deified kings. Adapa, human body with divine wisdom. The Apkallu, part human, part fish. Genesis 6, Nephilim as offspring of sons of God and daughters of. Men, Greek heroes, Perseus, Heracles, Achilles, demigods with divine parents. These aren't random mythical flourishes. They appear in king lists, genealogies and administrative texts alongside verified historical figures. Pattern 6. Post-catastrophe kingship restored. This appears in Sumerian king list. After the flood, kingship descended from heaven. Eridogenesis. Zeusudra receives blessing to continue after flood. Atrahasis, humanity allowed to survive and rebuild. Genesis 9, covenant with Noah's descendants to be fruitful and multiply. Various traditions of post-flood re-establishment of civilization. Authority wasn't created anew, it was restored according to pre-existing patterns. Pattern 7. Knowledge preservation through specific lineages. This appears in royal bloodlines claiming descent from divine human unions. Priestly families controlling temple libraries and education. Enheduanna and the succession of royal high priestesses. Scribal schools where sons learn, father's profession. Berossus, tablets buried before flood to preserve knowledge. The continuous copying of ancient texts by trained scribes. Knowledge transmission is institutional, hereditary, carefully controlled within families with resources to support long education. Pattern 8. Legitimate authority requires procedures. This appears in Inanna and Enki, proper bestowal of me through witnessed gift. Tablet of Destinies. Chaos results from improper possession. Royal inscriptions documenting divine selection and accomplishments. Law codes proving competent. Application of justice. Temple appointments requiring divine acceptance via omens. Genealogies establishing bloodline connection to previous legitimate rulers. Mere power isn't enough. Authority must be received, recognized, proven through specific procedures that vary by culture but maintain consistent principle. Legitimacy requires validation by existing institutional structures. When these 8 patterns are recognized across multiple independent sources, a compelling picture emerges. The ancient Near East preserved consistent memory of a pre-diluvial civilization with organized kingship. Catastrophic flood requiring survival protocol. Deliberate preservation of essential knowledge / bloodlines through catastrophe. Post-flood restoration rather than reinvention of civilization. Understanding that legitimate authority requires transmission from previous legitimate holders. Institution of specific families / bloodlines as preservers and transmitters of. Civilization building knowledge. Distinction between those who possess transmitted wisdom and those who don't. Documentation of these patterns across generations in permanent form tablets, stone inscriptions. The patterns don't prove the Sumerian interpretation is literally true, that gods physically handed kingship to humans, that Apkallu fishmen taught civilization, that Gilgamesh was measurably 2/3 divine. But the patterns do suggest the Sumerians were documenting something real, a post-catastrophe civilization that rebuilt using preserved knowledge rather than reinventing from scratch. A recognition that some families had access to this knowledge and others didn't. An institutional system for transmitting knowledge across generations through intensive education within privileged bloodlines. A political theology that justified this arrangement by claiming divine origin for the knowledge and divine selection of the bloodlines. Whether the knowledge actually came from gods or from a pre-catastrophe civilization that Sumerians remembered imperfectly through oral tradition, the result was the same. Certain families possessed civilization building capacity that required decades of training to transmit. Those families became the chosen bloodlines, not because their genetics were special, but because they held and transmitted something precious that civilization needed. The cross-cultural consistency of these patterns suggests they aren't just Mesopotamian. The flood survivor, the preserved knowledge, the hybrid divine-human figures, the restoration of kingship, these motifs appear in Hebrew, Greek, Indian and Chinese traditions, with variations in detail but consistency in structure. Either multiple civilizations independently invented identical mythological patterns, or they're all remembering the same real historical process, a catastrophe that destroyed previous civilization, a small number of survivors who preserved essential knowledge, a post-catastrophe world in which certain families led the rebuilding because they possessed the transmitted wisdom. The Sumerians documented it most thoroughly because they invented writing early enough to capture oral traditions while they were still detailed. They created institutional structures, temple libraries, scribal schools, king lists, law codes that preserved the patterns even as centuries passed. And when we read their tablets today, we're not reading fantasy or primitive superstition. We're reading careful documentation of how their civilization understood itself as a restoration of something older, transmitted through chosen bloodlines, descended from heaven through procedures that required proof and demonstration of competence. The patterns reveal what chosen bloodlines actually meant, not genetic superiority, but pedagogical inheritance, not divine dinar, but transmitted knowledge, not predetermined destiny, but responsibility to preserve and transmit what previous generations had preserved. The bloodlines were chosen because they chose, generation after generation, to bear the weight of civilization's inheritance, to teach their children, to maintain the temples, to copy the old tablets, to preserve what might otherwise be lost when catastrophe came again. The pattern survived the fall of dynasties, the collapse of empires, the death of languages. They survived because they were encoded redundantly across multiple texts, in multiple cities, carved in stone and pressed into clay and copied by scribes who understood their work was sacred, literally set apart as essential for civilization's continuity. 4,000 years later, we can still read the patterns. We can still trace the chosen bloodlines through the king lists. We can still recognize what the Sumerians were documenting, that civilization requires transmission, that transmission requires teachers, that teachers require training, and that societies which systematically preserve and transmit knowledge across generations will flourish, while those that don't will forget and collapse. The patterns are the proof, not of gods or myths, but of a systematic attempt to solve the fundamental problem of civilization, how to preserve what you know across catastrophe, conquest, and the inevitable mortality of individuals. The Sumerians solved it through chosen bloodlines, families positioned and trained to carry the inheritance, and they documented the solution so thoroughly that we, their distant descendants, can still learn from their example. The patterns persist. The inheritance continues. The chosen bloodlines fulfilled their function. They remembered, they transmitted, they endured, and the knowledge survived. 3 interpretations. The tablets exist. The excavations are documented. The translations are verified. The question is what the Sumerians thought they were recording when they documented 8 antediluvian kings, when they traced royal genealogies to divine parents, when they insisted that kingship descended from heaven. 3 major interpretive frameworks compete to explain these texts, each with scholarly advocates, each with strengths and limitations. Interpretation 1. Pure mythology. This is the dominant mainstream academic view. It reads Sumerian texts as mythological narratives serving political and religious functions within ancient society, but containing no historical core. In this view, the antediluvian kings are invented figures with symbolic reign lengths, not historical rulers. The flood is either entirely mythical or a memory of local flooding dramatically exaggerated. Divine parentage claims are political propaganda, metaphors for divine favour with no factual basis. The Apkallu are purely mythological culture heroes, like Prometheus in Greek tradition. Kingship descended from heaven is theological justification for monarchy, not description of actual origin. Strengths of this interpretation: it requires no extraordinary assumptions. It treats ancient texts the same way we treat Greek mythology, as culturally important narratives that tell us about beliefs and values, but not about actual historical events. It avoids pseudo-scientific speculation about ancient astronauts or lost super-civilizations. This view explains Sumerian texts as political theology. Kings claimed divine selection because it helped them maintain power. Royal genealogies included divine ancestors because it elevated the dynasty above rivals. The king list included mythical material because legitimacy required connecting historical dynasties to primordial origins. The method is familiar from other ancient societies: Roman emperors claiming descent from Venus, Japanese emperors from Amaterasu, pharaohs as literal incarnations of Horus. Political power seeks cosmic validation. Sumerians were doing what rulers everywhere have done, wrapping earthly authority in heavenly justification. Limitations: this interpretation struggles to explain why Sumerians documented these claims with such bureaucratic precision. If the antediluvian kings were invented, why include them in the same list with historical rulers? Why maintain the same documentary style throughout, treating mythical and historical material identically? Why did later scribes continue copying these texts for over 1,000 years after the claims could no longer serve anyone's political interests? Why preserve Sumerian myths in Akkadian, then in Neo-Assyrian, long after the Sumerian language died and the Sumerian cities had lost political relevance? The pure mythology view also doesn't easily explain the cross-cultural consistency of flood narratives, hybrid figures, and divine origin claims across Mediterranean and Near Eastern civilizations. Independent invention of identical mythological patterns is possible, but statistically unlikely given the specific detail parallels. Interpretation 2. Encoded wisdom. This view, popular among comparative religion scholars and some historians of ideas, reads Sumerian texts as philosophical and spiritual teachings encoded in narrative form. In this view, the antediluvian period represents humanity's primordial state of divine connection. The flood is psychological/spiritual catastrophe, the loss of original wisdom. Divine parentage symbolizes enlightened consciousness, not literal biology. The Apkallu represent archetypal-wise teachers who appear in every culture. Kingship descended from heaven means legitimate authority must align with cosmic order, Harma Tau, natural law. Strengths: this interpretation takes the text seriously as wisdom literature while avoiding literalism. It sees profound truths preserved in mythological language. It connects Mesopotamian thought to universal philosophical principles found across cultures. Adapa refusing immortality becomes a teaching about accepting human limitation while maximizing human potential. Gilgamesh's 2/3 divinity symbolizes the integrated human who has developed higher consciousness while remaining grounded in physical reality. The flood represents cyclical catastrophes, psychological, social, or historical, through which wisdom must be preserved. The Me become principles of cosmic order that enlightened rulers must understand and apply. The Tablet of Destinies symbolises higher knowledge that confers legitimate authority on whoever truly comprehends it. The chosen bloodlines are initiatic lineages, wisdom schools that transmit enlightenment teachings across generations. This view finds support in later Mesopotamian traditions, where kingship was explicitly understood as maintaining Ma'at, and where kings were judged based on whether they ruled in harmony with divine principles of justice. Limitations: while this interpretation illuminates profound meanings, it may over-intellectualize what were originally more concrete claims. When a text says Gilgamesh was 2/3 divine, the Sumerian scribes may have meant something more specific than he had higher consciousness. The encoding view also raises questions. Why encode wisdom so specific? Why mention exact cities, specific names, measurable reign lengths if the details are all symbolic? Pure allegory typically doesn't bother with such precision. And if these texts are wisdom teachings, why don't they include explicit interpretive keys the way mystical literature usually does? Where are the Sumerian equivalents of the Upanishads' philosophical discourses or the Tao Te Ching's meditative verses explaining what the symbols mean? Interpretation 3. Historical documentation. This most controversial view takes Sumerian texts as attempts at genuine historical documentation, perhaps imperfectly remembered, perhaps interpreted through theological lenses, but based on actual events and real knowledge transmission. In this view, the antediluvian period documents a pre-catastrophe civilization whose details were preserved through oral tradition. The flood was a real catastrophic event, whether global deluge or regional superflood. The massive rain lengths encode actual chronological information using a system we don't fully understand, perhaps different calendar, perhaps compressed genealogies, perhaps astronomical time. The Apkallu preserve memory of teachers from the earlier civilization who transmitted knowledge to post-catastrophe survivors. Divine parentage and hybrid figures may be imprecise memories of genetic or social engineering, or simply different classifications of human types based on capacity rather than biology. Kingship descended from heaven means political organization was learned/transmitted from predecessors rather than independently invented. Strengths: this. Interpretation explains the documentary tone of the texts. It accounts for why the Sumerians mixed historical and mythical material without distinguishing them. To them, it was all history, just from different periods with different levels of detail preservation. It explains the obsessive genealogies. If certain families actually did preserve knowledge through catastrophe, documenting those lineages would be essential for maintaining the transmission system. It explains why archaeological evidence shows sudden appearance of complex civilization around 3500 BC rather than gradual development. Post-catastrophe restoration happens faster than original invention. This view aligns with increasing archaeological evidence for major climatic catastrophes around 10,000, 12,000 years ago, end of Younger Dryas, massive flooding events in various regions, and puzzling continuities in technology and symbolism across supposedly disconnected ancient cultures. The recent discovery of Bekli Tepe in Turkey, sophisticated megalithic temples built around 9500 BC, then deliberately buried, demonstrates that our assumptions about when civilization began require constant revision. Older, more complex societies existed than we previously acknowledged. Limitations: this interpretation can easily slide into pseudo-scientific speculation. Without extraordinary evidence, claims of pre-flood civilizations remain highly speculative. The massive rain lengths still don't make sense, even with alternative calendar systems. No plausible model converts 28,800 years into realistic human lifespans. Mainstream archaeology has no evidence for a civilization sophisticated enough to develop writing, mathematics, and astronomy before 4000 BCE. While absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, we can't build confident historical models on pure speculation about undiscovered civilizations. This view also risks treating mythological narrative as journalistic reporting, ignoring that ancient texts had different purposes and truth claims than modern historical documentation. The Sumerians weren't trying to write history textbooks. They were preserving traditions that served cultural, religious, and political functions. Synthesis. What we can reasonably conclude. Each interpretation captures something true. The pure mythology view correctly notes that these texts served political and religious functions, that they established cosmic legitimacy for earthly power, that they shouldn't be read as literal. Journalism. The encoded wisdom view correctly identifies profound philosophical principles about authority, order, justice, and human potential preserved in these narratives. The historical documentation view correctly observes that Sumerians treated these texts as record-keeping, that patterns are too consistent to be pure fiction, that oral tradition can preserve genuine historical memory across many generations. Perhaps the question isn't which interpretation is right, but what combination best explains the evidence. What if the Sumerians were documenting real historical patterns, post-catastrophe civilization, knowledge transmission through specific families, institutional procedures for transferring authority, but interpreting those patterns through theological framework that attributed divine origin to what? Were actually human discovered or human preserved processes? What if kingship descended from heaven accurately describes their experience? Political organisation appeared suddenly in their cities because it was transmitted from elsewhere or from earlier times, not because locals independently invented it. From their perspective, it descended. It came from outside their immediate cultural context. What if the antediluvian kings preserved genuine genealogical memory of founding families, but the chronology was either corrupted in transmission or encoded using principles we don't understand? What if divine parentage claims sometimes refer to literal descent from dynasty founders, sometimes to metaphorical adoption into priesthood or royal houses, and sometimes to educational inheritance of divine wisdom through intensive training? The tablets document a civilization that understood itself as inheritor rather than inventor, that traced its knowledge to teachings received at the beginning, that organised knowledge transmission through specific families with resources for long education, that created procedures for validating legitimate authority based on bloodline, education, and demonstrated competence. Whether the ultimate origin was literal gods, a pre-catastrophe civilization, brilliant culture heroes, or gradual accumulation that was later attributed to divine sources, the Sumerians successfully preserved and transmitted knowledge across thousands of years. They created the first writing system, first law codes, first schools, first libraries, first empire, first literary authors, first mathematical notation, first astronomical charts, first medical texts. Either they invented all of this within a few centuries, or they were restoring what had been known before. Either way, they succeeded in transmitting it to successor civilizations: Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, eventually us. The chosen bloodlines, whether divinely selected, pedagogically privileged, or merely the families that happened to preserve the texts, fulfilled their function. Civilization continued. And 4,000 years later, we can still read their tablets, still learn from their example, still grapple with the same question they grappled with: how do we preserve what we know and transmit it to the next generation? They documented their answer through chosen bloodlines, trained from childhood, positioned to receive and transmit, proven worthy through demonstration, maintained across generations through institutional structures and careful record keeping. We may interpret their documentation differently than they did. We may read mythology where they saw history, or see history where they intended theology. But the tablets remain. The inheritance survived. the transmission succeeded. That, in the end, is what matters most. Not whether we believe the Sumerians' interpretation of their own records, but that we recognise they solved a fundamental problem: how to make civilization persist across catastrophe. They chose bloodlines, they trained them, they documented everything, they passed it on, and we received it, the quiet inheritance. The clay tablets sit in climate-controlled museum vaults now. Oxford, Philadelphia, Chicago, Istanbul, London, Paris. Scattered across modern empires, these fragments of fired mud-preserved words, pressed by long-dead hands into soft earth, then baked hard by time. In the Ashmolean Museum, that small prism still lists the kings. When kingship descended from heaven, when it moved from city to city, when the flood swept over, when it descended again. The weight hasn't changed, still 2 kilograms of clay. But the information it contains has crossed 4 millennia, travelled from Mesopotamia to Europe, survived the fall of every empire that once ruled the land between the 2 rivers. Sumer is gone, Akkad is gone, Babylon is gone, Assyria is gone. The cities are tells now, artificial hills covering layer upon layer of collapsed mud brick. The temples are foundations. The ziggurats are eroded mounds. The irrigation channels are desert wadis, where nothing grows, but the words survived, the king lists, the flood stories, the hymns, the wisdom texts, the astronomical tables, the mathematical exercises, the medical prescriptions, the legal codes, survived because scribes kept copying them, generation after generation, long after Sumerian was a dead language, long after the dynasties documented in the king list had been forgotten by everyone except scholars preserving old tablets, long after any political purpose could be served by maintaining these traditions. They copied them because they understood this is the inheritance, this must not be lost. Perhaps that's the real answer to our question, not which bloodlines were chosen, or why, or by whom, but simply some people in every generation choose to carry the weight, choose to preserve what might be lost, choose to transmit to the next generation what the previous generation transmitted to them. The Sumerian explanation that kingship descended from heaven, that certain families were divinely selected, that knowledge came from the gods through supernatural teachers, served them well. It created a framework for identifying who should rule, for training those people systematically, for maintaining standards across generations. Whether gods were involved or not, the system worked. Civilization persisted in Mesopotamia for 3,000 years. Writing survived. Mathematics advanced. Astronomy became sophisticated enough to predict eclipses. Law codes evolved. Literary traditions deepened. Medical knowledge accumulated. All because some families, royal families, priestly families, scribal families, took seriously the responsibility of preserving and transmitting. They trained their children. They copied the old tablets. They maintained the schools. They performed the rituals that encoded seasonal observations. They recorded the decisions that became precedents. They were chosen by being willing to be chosen, by accepting the burden, by staying at the task generation after generation when easier lives were available. Not all royal families succeeded. Some dynasties fell because kings stopped applying the wisdom they'd inherited. Some priestly lines failed to train successors adequately. Some cities lost their libraries to fire, flood, or war. The system wasn't perfect. Catastrophes still happened. Knowledge was still sometimes lost. But enough succeeded that the chain continued. Broken links were repaired. Lost texts were reconstructed from copies in other cities. Failed dynasties were replaced by new ones who learned from their predecessors' mistakes. The inheritance passed forward. And eventually it reached us. Not perfectly intact, huge amounts of Mesopotamian literature are lost forever, not unchanged. Each generation adapted the traditions to new circumstances, but continuous, preserved enough that we can still read in Hedwana's poetry, still calculate using Sumerian mathematics, still trace the king lists, still learn from their law codes. We are their distant students, sitting in their schoolroom 4,000 years later, reading the lessons they assigned, learning that civilization is not natural, that it requires deliberate transmission, that someone in each generation must carry the inheritance forward or it dies. Perhaps the question was never really about bloodlines. Perhaps it was always about this. Will someone in the next generation care enough to preserve what this generation knows? Will anyone choose to bear the weight? The Sumerians organised this question through royal dynasties and priestly families. We organise it through universities and libraries and public education. Different mechanisms, same essential function, identifying people who will dedicate their lives to preserving and transmitting knowledge. The specific families don't matter as much as the function. What matters is that the knowledge survives, that each generation teaches the next, that the inheritance continues. In that sense, the bloodlines are still being chosen, not by God's determining destiny before birth, but by individuals deciding to take responsibility, to learn deeply, to teach faithfully, to preserve carefully, to transmit completely. You, wherever you are, as dawn breaks or night settles, have heard the story now. The Sumerian explanation for why certain bloodlines led humanity, because kingship descended from heaven, because knowledge was transmitted by divine teachers, because the flood survivor preserved the seed, because the chosen families carried it forward. Whether you believe their explanation or prefer another, the function remains. Civilization requires preservation. Preservation requires people willing to carry the inheritance. Perhaps that's what chosen really means. Not selected by divine decree, but self-selected by the decision to remember, to learn, to preserve, to transmit, generation after generation, through catastrophe and calm, despite the falls of empires and the deaths of languages. The clay tablets sit in museums, carefully catalogued, slowly being translated, gradually being digitized, so they'll survive the next catastrophe when it comes. The inheritance continues. The bloodlines, not genetic now, but pedagogical, still carry civilization forward. Different families, different mechanisms, same function. The weight of clay hasn't changed, but it has passed through countless hands, from the first scribe in Eridu to the archaeologist in Oxford, from Enheduanna to the graduate student who translates her poetry today. An inheritance quietly carried across 4,000 years by people who chose, are choosing, will choose to bear the weight. The question remains open. Not why were certain bloodlines chosen, but will someone in the next generation choose to carry it forward? The tablets preserve the Sumerian answer, yes, generation after generation, through flood and fire, across the death of languages and the collapse of empires. Someone always chooses. The inheritance continues. The bloodlines endure. And in that quiet persistence, that stubborn refusal to let civilization die, that decision repeated across countless generations to teach, to preserve, to remember, perhaps that's the real meaning of being chosen. Not destiny assigned by gods, but responsibility accepted by humans who understand that what we know can be lost, that what we've inherited must be transmitted, that civilization is fragile and precious and worth the wait. The clay tablets rest quietly in their vaults, holding their ancient words, waiting for the next reader. The inheritance is secure, for now, until the next generation, as it has always been, as it will always need to be. Let the questions settle as sleep comes. Good night.